Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from throughout the planet. We want to welcome you today for today's International Schiller Institute Conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. We're very happy that you can join us today. We will begin today's proceedings with remarks from the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, known throughout the world for his unique ability to speak to all people about those values and ideas that unite us all. This is from a speech that he gave in 2003 to a conference in New York City devoted to world education with a specific emphasis on Pakistan.
If you look around the world today, you have two pictures. One, a fearful one, a spread of war, threat of war, terror. On the other hand, in Asia in particular, Eurasia in general, there's a new movement, new cooperation among the nations of Asia, steps toward cooperation. Pakistan, India, China, Southeast Asia, Iran, nations of Central Asia, Russia, moving toward Europe. The world is in a great crisis. Great economic crisis. The financial system is in danger of collapse and will collapse. But we can fix that. Governments have the power to fix those kinds of problems, and life will go on. The problem is, above all, is the mind of the people of the world. And is the case of Pakistan, as you have emphasized with your program, the support of education program. The problem is, look at the faces of the poor of the world. Not only Pakistan, but the poor of India, the poor of Southeast Asia. And you look in the eyes of poverty, or poverty in Africa. What do you see? You see a mind which is the human mind, which is capable of doing everything every other human mind can do in general. But you see that the lack of education, the lack of hope, the lack of connection is like a prison. It's not only a prison in denying them the knowledge they need to have the skills to produce, but it's a psychological prison, a spiritual prison. They don't know the world in which they live. The world in which they live in the large is a stranger. It's a frightening stranger. And so therefore, when it comes to the kind of project with which you are concerned here tonight, the project of education, for the poor, especially of Pakistan, who otherwise would not have the education that you're working to provide for them. We think that the spiritual goal is almost as important, or maybe more important, than the economic goal. I know that in the period of World War II, when the United States had gone through a great period of pessimism in the 1920s and early 1930s, we began to come out of that pessimism during the period of the 1930s and the war. We were able to meet the challenge of war and the challenge of the hope of peace which Roosevelt represented, because there was optimism in the people. I saw things happen in wartime, under wartime conditions, which expressed optimism. People would do what they thought was impossible because they were optimistic. And the function, I think, of education, especially the education in poor countries, is to give the child the basis for belief in optimism, for the belief that we can do things, that the belief that by cooperating we can make things different, we can change things for the better. And that's what I look for. I'm privileged now because of my work internationally in dealing with countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Europe, elsewhere. I see that there's the possibility of optimism. But then I see, when I look at the poor countries, such as Pakistan and India, which have many poor, even though many are not poor, but many poor, I think what will happen to the effort to build peace in this part of the world if we leave the mass of the population, the majority of the population, ignorant and poor, with a sense of hopelessness that can become a disease that can destroy all our wonderful aspirations. So I must say briefly, that to be as brief as possible, I can say much more about many things, and maybe you would like to ask me about some of these things. later tonight, that this is a very worthy cause. It's a small part of what is needed, but sometimes we set an example by a small effort and hope that others will be inspired by what is accomplished by the small effort, and hope that therefore that example will inspire others to do more.
If you are just joining us, and wherever you happen to be joining us from, we want to welcome you today for the International Schiller Institute Conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. To begin today's plenary session presentations, it is my honor to introduce the founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Dear conference participants from all over the world, what brings us here together today with participants from over 60 countries, from 4 continents, is our utmost distress that the very existence of humanity is in grave danger. The aim of our conference is to arouse the awareness of ever larger social forces around the world that because of the danger of the presently escalating strategic confrontation, there could be soon a full military engagement between NATO and Russia, leading to a world war which in all likelihood would mean the annihilation of mankind in a following nuclear winter. The aim of our conference is therefore to demonstrate in the most powerful way that there exists an immediately accessible alternative, a paradigm which can leave that mortal threat behind us and begin a new era of human history in cohesion with the true nature of mankind as the only species known so far capable of reason. That danger of a large war did not start on February 24th of this year. As my late husband Lyndon LaRouche forecasted with prescience in August 1971, after Nixon replaced the fixed exchange rates of the Bretton Woods system with floating exchange rates, that a continuation of this monetarist policy, unless corrected, would lead inevitably to a new fascism and a new world war. And that is 50 years later, exactly where we are right now. The acute danger of war, the larger war, comes from the fact that the transatlantic neoliberal financial system was already at the advanced stage of breakdown of a hyperinflationary explosion of a hopelessly bankrupt system before the war in Ukraine started. In order to understand the real reasons for the Ukraine crisis, one has to go back to the reasons why the great historic chance which existed after the disintegration of the Soviet Union for the establishment of a true peace order, as we proposed with the program of the Eurasian Land Bridge then, was missed. A good entry point, a window to get an insight, is a document that was originally leaked to the New York Times by a whistleblower in March 1992, which became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was written in the spirit of the earlier Project of a New American Century. It stated that part of the American mission would be to ensure its role as the only superpower in the post-Soviet world, which would have sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging America's primacy. On March 8th, in 92, the New York Times wrote, "The Pentagon documents the clearest rejection to date of collective internationalism, the strategy that emerged from World War II when the 5 victorious powers sought to form a United Nations that could mediate disputes and police outbreaks of violence." The Wolfowitz Doctrine was the real reason why the promise given to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east by Secretary of State James Baker at 3 different occasions in February 1990 was not kept. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, based on the Anglo-American special relationship, was the basic axiom for a whole array of policies to follow, starting with the so-called shock therapy of the IMF-backed liberal reforms in Russia in the 90s, which in light of the wealth of raw materials and scientific expertise of Russia was aimed explicitly to eliminate a potential future competitor on the world market, and which reduced the industrial capacity of Russia from 91 to 94 to only 30%. It was the basis for the various interventionist wars in Iraq, the bombing against Yugoslavia, wars against Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, as well as the 5 NATO expansions to the east. Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 was a dramatic protest against the enactment of the unipolar world, which remained essentially as unanswered as the various definitions of red lines concerning the core security interest of Russia, up to the recent one to the United States and NATO on December 17th, articulated by Putin. The conflict between the claim to maintain essentially an unipolar world and the emergence of a multipolar world, which was the natural result of the economic rise of China, the attraction of the BRI for over 100 countries, the strategic partnership between Russia and China, and more recently, the refusal of many countries such as India, Pakistan, Brazil, South Africa, and others to be drawn into the geopolitical confrontation between the West and Russia and China. That conflict is at the core of the present danger. It is terrible that we have a war in the middle of Europe. But so were the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, etc. But they almost did not exist in the news. And did anybody think the Russian military could have come to another conclusion when they saw the pounding of ever harsher sanctions, the acting out of various think tank scenarios, and the choruses of Western politicians about crushing the Russian economy, crushing Putin, crushing the Russian system, the largest nuclear power on the planet? And now, after the negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian delegations in Turkey had reached a first hopeful step, pictures of the atrocities of war, without even a minute of presumption of innocence until proven guilty in respect to the authorship, serve to apply further sanctions, an expulsion of diplomats, the open threat of bankrupting Russia. The policy is openly aimed at regime change in an effort to make not only Putin, but also all of Russia a pariah among nations for the indefinite future, exclude her from the UN Security Council, even the United Nations and the G20, which will destroy these institutions. It will cause the complete political and economic decoupling between the West and Russia and China. This policy already has and is doing devastating damage to the physical economy worldwide, the so-called supply chains, and it is catapulting the potential victims of a world famine to 1 billion people, that is 1/8 of the entire human species. There are already hunger protests in many countries in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. Meanwhile, the inflation in prices for food, energy, raw materials threatens to halve the industrial production in many countries. Mass unemployment looms and a total collapse into chaos. A new system is already emerging, centered on China and the BRI, Russia, India, and others. There are many new strategic alignments occurring: the SCO, the BRICS, the OIC, China relations, the many relations among the global south. But even a conception of a multipolar world does not solve the problem, because it simply implies the danger of a geopolitical confrontation. We need a dramatic, sudden change in the way we organize our affairs. It has to start with an honest, explicit insight that a continuation of the present policies risk a conflict where there would be no winner, and therefore a new peace conference is needed in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. The recognition that the only option left was to have peace negotiations dawned on the warrior parties after 150 years of religious war in Europe, of which the 30 Years' War was only the culmination, since they realized that nobody would be left alive to enjoy the victory if the war would continue. Today, we are in a nuclear war. Many cities would be dead within hours, and the rest of humanity would suffer ailing in a nuclear-contaminated world until either all life ends or the few unhappy survivors would contemplate why mankind was not able to prevent its own destruction. Therefore, there must be an immediate convening of an emergency conference in the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia, where, for the sake of peace, all crimes committed by one side or the other must be forgiven and forgotten. And for the sake of peace, all policy must take into account the interest of the other. There must be the intention to create a new international security and development architecture, which takes into account the security interest of every single country on the planet. There must be an immediate ceasefire, and a new credit system must be created to replace the bankrupt financial system as the real cause for the war danger. It must be based on the principles of the original Bretton Woods system as it was intended by FDR, but due to his early death, never was implemented. These principles, which Lyndon-LaRouche outlined in a draft memorandum of agreement between the United States and the USSR, published March 30, 1984, after the Soviet Union had rejected the offer by President Reagan to cooperate in making nuclear weapons obsolete by technological means, are still absolutely valid today. In this memorandum, it says, Article 1, General Conditions for Peace. The political foundation for durable peace must be the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and b. cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefit of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of the present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relation between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classed as, quote, developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and the Soviet Union, today the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interest of each and all, these powers are bound to that degree in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between these powers. The commitment to engage in a global poverty eradication program, such as it is outlined, for example, in the report by the Schiller Institute, The New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge, or the proposal of China for a cooperation between the Belt and Road Initiative, the Build Back Better program of the United States, and the Global Gateway program of the EU, can become the actual development underpinning for such a global security architecture. Ukraine, rather than being the cannon fodder in a geopolitical confrontation, can be the bridge between Europe and the other Eurasian nations. In light of the present and the danger of future pandemics, there must be the construction of a modern health system in every country. In light of the famine threatening the life of 1 billion people and the expected population growth Governments must take emergency actions to double the food production to ensure a healthy diet for all human beings. International law, as it was developed out of the Peace of Westphalia and was established in the UN Charter, must be reinstituted without any limitations. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence must be the guidelines for the cooperation among all nations. The present existential crisis has demonstrated that mankind has one common future or none, and that we must put in the interest of the one humanity before all national interest, and that from now on every national interest must be in cohesion with the interest of humanity as a whole. It is an expression of the richness of our human civilization that it has generated different cultures. We must advance the dialogue of the best tradition of these cultures, the most beautiful creations in science and art, as the demonstration of the unique creativity of man, and in that way create a new renaissance which will start a new era of mankind. We will replace hatred and prejudice against other cultures, which only exists if we don't know them, with a tender love for all of humanity, because it is the most precious good in the known universe.
Thank you, Helga. If you are just joining us, we want to welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute Conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. And we have just heard the keynote address by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, The Need for a New Paradigm. We are especially happy to have with us today His Excellency Ambassador Anatoly Antonov, Ambassador of the Russian Federation to the United States. His topic is Prospects for Building a New International Security Architecture.
Dear friends, I would like to thank the Schiller Institute and its chairwoman, Ms. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, for the opportunity to share my view on the prospects for establishing a new security architecture. Over the past 100 years, the system of regional and global security has been retailored 3 times. Following World War I, the victorious countries shaped a European order, but it lasted only 20 years. World War II gave rise to the establishment of a system of international relations that reflected the balance of power and was based on the maximum consideration of national interests. Perhaps the founding of the UN, with the fundamental role of the Security Council and reliance on the international law, were its core elements that united all nations. Nevertheless, the Cold War divided the world. A psychological, ideological, economic war was waged against the Soviet Union. We were branded as an evil empire and a source of constant global tension. The task pursued by the West was to stifle the development of the Soviet Union, prevent the transfer of advanced technologies to us, and doom our country to be a second-tier nation. The third attempt to form a world order was made after the dissolution of the USSR. The United States and its allies declared themselves the Cold War's winners and began to reshuffle international relations to suit exclusively their interests. In fact, it was the very moment when the basis for the infamous rules-based order was laid. In the new environment, an increasingly diminishing role was given to the UN and other international institutions unless they were controlled by Washington. But even in such a reality, the new Russia made an attempt to meet the West halfway. We were excessively open and credulous. We proposed new cooperation and interaction projects. We demonstrated our readiness to compromise, making unforgivable concessions in some cases. The West cynically took advantage of such constructive approach. It hypocritically tried to point out that from that point on, Russia's place was on the outskirts of the new world order. The Warsaw Pact disappeared, but NATO was not going to disband. Moreover, over recent years, the world was witnessed 5 waves of the alliance expansion. Its military machine is in fact on our doorstep. Lately, NATO's military activity has considerably intensified. About 40 major military exercises are held annually near Russian border. The forces of the North Atlantic Alliance are exploring the Black and Baltic Seas. By the way, according to the latest estimates of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the combined military expenditures of NATO countries exceed Russia's defensive budget by at least 25 times. For decades now, the West has been cool with the dismantling of the collective security system developed after World War II. We have lost key global security agreements, the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. In fact, the only agreement left today is New START that continues to meet the national interests of Russia and the United States. It is the gold standard for strategic stability which must be preserved. The Russian side finds totally unacceptable the efforts of NATO countries to militarily explore the territories of Ukraine and Georgia and establish a network of American biological laboratories along our borders. The situation has become extremely dangerous. We have repeatedly said that any system of European security must take into account the national interest of all states, including, of course, Russia. Our country cannot be an object of some phantom defense projects. We must be an equal party of European and global security with full voting status. Russia has never insisted on any unilateral advantages. All we have demanded was respect and recognition of Russia's national interests. At the end of the last year, our country put forward concrete proposals to rectify the unfair world order. Our ideas were summarized in 2 draft treaties with the United States and NATO. In essence, we propose a peaceful initiative offering our vision of security architecture. Those drafts were made public. They covered such matters as non-enlargement of NATO, non-deployment of weapons system posing a threat to the Russian Federation near our borders, a moratorium on INF fielding, as well as specific initiatives to increase the predictability and reduce dangerous military activities. However, our key proposals were rejected. Politicians who tried to reduce the whole issue to the crisis in Ukraine are ignoring its origins and driving the discussions to a dead end. They look at the situation superficially, disregarding the root cause of the events. According to this logic, Russia, along with the United States and the UK, can be blamed for the occupation in 1945 of Nazi Germany that did so much evil and inflicted so many sufferings on the entire world. The Soviet Union alone lost 27 million people in that war. Today it's extremely important to achieve the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, to consolidate Kyiv's nuclear-free status and its commitment to international agreements on the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We must do everything to prevent the undermining of the NPT. There should be no threats to the Russian Federation coming from the Ukrainian territory. This is the objective of our special military operation. It is extremely important that Western countries stop adding fuel to the fire by pumping Kyiv's regime with weapons. Moreover, there is an obvious need for the United States and their allies to urge Ukraine to respect international humanitarian law. We will never tolerate the shootings of civilians as well as the killing and torturing of captured Russian soldiers. I would like to stress the need to immediately put an end to the spreading of fake news that discredits the great mission of the Russian military. A blatant example is the slander against us regarding the situation in Bucha. Staged scenes that distort the truth must be unacceptable. Our country advocates for urgent actions on the international arena. The principle of equal and indivisible security must be restored. It means that no state has a right to strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. With political will, this can be easily achieved through the development of serious long-term legal guarantees. We insist on the need to strengthen international law and reinforce the role of the United Nations and its key body, the Security Council. The Russian proposals do not infringe on the security of the NATO countries. On the contrary, they create conditions for de-escalation in Europe, a restoration of trust and intensification of interaction in order to address global challenges, such as the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and means of their delivery, rebuilding of national economies, and settlement of serious climate change issues. To conclude, I would like to recall the ideas of an American statesman, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In his book, Diplomacy, he predicted the failure of the so-called Wilsonian foreign policy model of spreading democracy. Let me quote, "However powerful America is, no country has the capacity to impose all its preferences on the rest of mankind. America will have to learn to operate in a balance of power system." Kissinger also said, Russia-American relations desperately need a serious dialogue on foreign policy issues, based on mutual respect of each other's national interests. Dear friends, let me assure you that our country is always open to interaction of this kind. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Antonov. And if you've just joined us, you are watching and participating in the International Schiller Institute Conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. Our next speaker, and a prime moving force in the work to organize today's conference, is Sam Pitroda, former cabinet minister and advisor to Rajiv Gandhi and several other prime ministers of India. His topic, the need to redesign the world. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Chicago. War in Ukraine, like any other war, is of great concern to humanity. It is of concern to all of us because it makes our fellow human being miserable due to deaths, destructions, displacement, poverty, hunger, hate, false propaganda. There is no reason for a war in 2022. Nothing can justify all the destruction that is going on. I'm not here to take sides. I'm here basically to talk about a need to redesign the world. Today's security order is based on command and control, as opposed to collaboration, cooperation, co-creation, and communication. Today's world order is also based on total commitment to power and profits, as opposed to what is good for planet and what is good for people. I wrote a book on Redesign the World, mainly because I believe that in a hyper-connected world of today and tomorrow, when all 8 billion people are essentially connected, we need a new paradigm. What does it mean to have connected world? How do we use this connectivity to take human civilization to the next level? World was last designed after World War II, which gave birth to UN, World Bank, IMF, NATO, WTO, and WHO, and many organizations. It also gave birth to GDP, GNP, per capita income, balance of payment, and various measurements. This design did pretty well in growth, prosperity, rebuilding Europe, rebuilding Japan. But at the same time, this design has not solved the problems related to poverty, hunger, violence, war. This design was based on democracy, human rights, capitalism, consumption, and military. Right after the design, world got decolonized. No one ever thought that world will be decolonized in such a short period of time. Then no one thought China would be able to rise the way China has been able to rise. Soviet Union fell apart without a drop of blood. And then for a while, world became unipolar. In the process, technology became pervasive, inequality increased, and then 9/11 changed everything. Finally, COVID-19 reminds us that we are all interconnected, interwoven, interdependent, interrelated. What matters at the end of the day relates to only two things: planet and people. We have really created huge blunders with our environment, global warming, and we have not taken care of our people. What we really need now is a whole new paradigm. We need to take our democracies or whatever form of governments we have to inclusion. We need to provide dignity to people, respect to all other human beings. And we can't go on attacking people where innocent people get killed, mainly because there is a power struggle at the top. We need to really focus on human needs. Human rights are not good enough. We live in an environment where we can produce anything. Unfortunately, we still think of economy of scarcity when we have economy of surplus. What are we fighting about? There is enough for everybody and some more, because technology has offered us unique opportunity in production, management, distribution, delivery, markets, trade, but we have to think differently. Many times I say that we have 19th century mindset, 20th century processes, and 21st century needs. Capitalism hasn't delivered fruits to everybody. It has increased inequality where very few people have lots of wealth and lots of people don't have anything. We need new economy, decentralization, bottom-up development, networking of companies, and we need to focus on localization while we still promote globalization. There is a lot of wisdom in local talent, local resources, local soil, and we need to take advantage of that. We can't go to globalization just because we can optimize profits. GDP may not be the right way to look at economy. We need gross environmental product, gross human development products, and the whole idea of consumption has gone too far. We wind up producing for people who can afford to buy and not for people who need it. We need focus on sustainability. We need focus on conservation. And finally, I come from the Mahatma Gandhi's roots. I believe firmly in non-violence. In this world, there is no room for violence. And violence begins at home, on the streets, in the cities. And our response to violence is to provide more hardware, more military equipment. Today, we produce $2 billion worth of military hardware. We spend $2 trillion. When we know 200 billion can eliminate hunger in the world, I think it is about time to begin to focus on non-violence everywhere. But what do we do with this idea? So the idea is to take democracy to inclusion, human rights to human needs, capitalism to new economy, consumption to conservation and sustainability, and military to non-violence. How do we do this? Because those who have desire to change have no power. And those who have power are already milking the system and they have no interest in changing. So we really need to begin new conversation. We need to begin conversation at the bottom of the economic pyramid. We need change agents. We need new institutions. And we need to break some of the existing institutions. I believe some institutions have outlived their utility. In last 75 years, we have not created one new major global institution like UN, World Bank, IMF. I think it is about time to think of the redesign of the world. And that redesign must have people and planet at the center of the design. We need to constantly ask, if it is good for planet, we should do it. If it is good for human beings, we should do it. Unfortunately, today, our design, as I said earlier, is focused on power and profits. Until that mindset changes from command and control to coordination, cooperation, networking, co-creation, we will not create new paradigm for the mankind. I firmly believe that hyperconnectivity, which democratizes information, decentralizes decision-making, demonetizes services with content, context, curation, communication, is a unique opportunity for mankind with innovations, creativity to take humanity to the next level. I believe in the redesign. I'm not here to really emphasize anything else, but I'm convinced that we all need to join hands to create new world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. You are watching and participating in the International Schiller Institute Conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. Our next presenter is Mr. J. Naidoo of South Africa. He is a former cabinet minister under President Nelson Mandela, and he's speaking to us today on the African perspective. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. And I present to you today an African citizen's perspective. Alongside most African citizens, I am deeply concerned about the human suffering in Ukraine and call for the war to end, for Russia to withdraw its armed forces, and for the humanitarian crisis to be urgently addressed. I urge that NATO and Russia sit around a negotiation table and that a lasting peace settlement to be reached that embraces a new, secure, and envisioned peace between Eastern and Western Europe. The world does not need another world war or even the doomsday scenario of a nuclear winter. The UN Charter commits all of us to find a peaceful means to settle our differences and ensure that sovereignty and integrity of all states needs to be upheld. I have played a role as a freedom fighter against apartheid. I've been a member of President Nelson Mandela's cabinet. I reiterate that the only way we can rise above our differences and our constituencies and find common ground is through peaceful negotiations. Will we find the courage to see and understand each other and manage both transition and diversity in our world? Africa has no intention of becoming again the theater of proxy wars in geopolitical conflicts between global powers. Humanity is facing an intersect of global crises that create a perfect storm for an extinction event. Science overwhelmingly confirms we are living through a dire ecological emergency with rising pandemics, inequality, hunger, and poverty. The world cannot afford a nuclear war, another arms race, or even conventional warfare. And yet, that's exactly what is happening. No one wants another Cold War. In Africa, we paid heavily in the massive loss of lives, the destruction of infrastructure, and even our social fabric. In 1990, we welcomed the ending of the Cold War and the dream of a nuclear arms-free world. South Africa historically dismantled its nuclear arms program and argued alongside its African peers for a new world order based on peace, on multilateral cooperation, and a new global security architecture based on sustainable development. Our shared imperative is for a permanent and transformative global peace. Imagine a world that had embraced a proposal made by Gorbachev in 1986 when he announced a Soviet proposal for a ban on all nuclear weapons by 2000. Or if the vision of Olof Palme, then Swedish Prime Minister, had been achieved, what he echoed on all our behalf, that a nuclear war can hit all peoples and all states, even those that are furthest away from the theater of war. But this also means that all peoples and all nations have a right to have a say about these weapons of mass destruction. We have wasted an important moment to secure global peace, arms reduction. The momentum behind the end of nuclear weapons was lost as agreements fell by the wayside, and 3 decades later, we face a crisis of a new arms race. The Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is the only commitment with a multilateral goal of nuclear disarmament enforced in 1970 that needs to be reactivated, and a comprehensive framework put into place democratically that represents the will of all of humanity. In the crude binaries of global geopolitical temper, African citizens have chosen to stand above these narratives. Africa has historically been part of a non-aligned movement. Our continent is already burning through conflicts waged in the resource wars that afflict us, driven by predatory interests of global multinationals that seek to recolonize our continent and impose yet another brutally exploitative model of violent extraction. Africa has its challenges related to eradicating our continent as an epicenter of hunger. We want our sovereignty respected. We cannot divert our scarce resources to a heightened global arms race. In a world where we seek to build a functioning and responsible global governance, we need to reimagine a very different world to the one that we faced in 1989, 1990, or even post the Second World War. The Security Council of the UN is an anachronism of a world long gone, constrained by the divisions between its 5 permanent veto-wielding members, the US, Russia, France, and China, with each prioritizing its own interests and influence. We argue for a new security architecture that reflects the will and aspirations of more than major global powers. Africa, with its 54 countries and 1.4 billion citizens, cannot be excluded from meaningful participation in decision-making. African citizens want to be part of a global movement that bridges the old divides of East and West. A continent with mineral and natural resources that fuel a global economy, and the youngest profile of demographics in the world wants a new economic and political deal that seeks to build a transformative peace. We don't need any global power acting as our policeman. We strive to rise above the paradigm of war driven by imperial and colonial thinking. Centrally, the goal we seek to tackle is the climate crisis head-on, building a circular green economy that embraces sustainable human development and renewable energy. Our hope is that Africa will have its voice heard, not just of our governments, but also the debate on a new inclusive and developmental architecture must include the voices of citizens, civic groups, students, women, youth, and a broad range of grassroots organizations and coalitions. We contend with a chemistry of circumstances and crises that we can galvanize a new beginning of what makes us human, what defines a positive passage for our evolutionary journey to a better humanity, away from war, economic and political aggression, and militarism towards a new transformative global peace. As our president, Nelson Mandela, wisely said, it always seems impossible until it's done. I pray and hope along the majority of African citizens that we find the political will today to find that piece of Mandela within ourselves, to manifest a greater humanity that we are capable of achieving. I thank you.
And we thank you for those very important words. You've just heard from Mr. J. Naidoo of South Africa, who spoke to us on an African citizen's perspective. And welcome to all from all around the world that are attending this conference today. From China, we will now hear from Chen Xiaohan of the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, speaking on a shared future for mankind.
Dear President Helga, Zepp-LaRouche, friends, first of all, I'd like to present warm compliments to you all. It is my pleasure to attend this international conference hosted by International Schiller Institute. The world today is undergoing major changes and great pandemic both unseen in the scenery. With intense and complicated major power rivalry and escalated regional hotspots issues, the world has entered a period of new turbulence and transformation, and the international order is facing severe challenges. Against this backdrop, it is of great significance for President Helga and the Schiller Institute to initiate this conference. I believe today's conference will be very productive and successful to review international situation and explore ideas to build together a better world for all. At the moment, I like to avail myself of this opportunity to pay tribute to President Helga and the Schiller Institute, who have been making endeavors to promote cultural exchanges, mutual understanding among different peoples, as well as common development of the world over decades. Speaking of the international situation, the crisis in Ukraine, which impacts the world, is indeed deeply distressing and, more importantly, and has propelled us to reflect profoundly. I recall clearly that some Western strategists, including George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, and John Mearsheimer, all sounded an alarm for the crisis years ago. Yet the situation still comes to what we have seen today. The lesson is painful and profound, and the root cause lies in regional security contradictions fermented over decades. A fundamental solution is to accommodate the legitimate security concerns of all relevant parties. China supports Europe to play a leading role and supports Europe, Russia, the US, and NATO to hold dialogue, facing up to the tensions that have piled up over the years and found solutions so as to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security framework in Europe. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council and responsible major country, China will continue to make its voice heard, put forward initiatives, and take actions to stop war and promote peace and earnestly safeguard regional and world peace and stability. Dear friends, facing emerging global challenges, human society is once again standing at a critical historical juncture, answering the questions of what's wrong with the world and what should we do. She offered China's proposition: build community with a shared future for mankind, encourage all countries, rise above the differences in social system, history, and culture, and work together to build an open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security, and common prosperity. First, we should stay committed to building a world of lasting peace through dialogue and consultation. We should jointly safeguard global peace and security, abandon all forms of Cold War mentality and hegemonism. Countries should coordinate with each other equally and resolve disputes based on mutual respect, so as to foster a new type of international relations based on dialogue, non-confrontation, and non-alliance. Second, we should build a world of common security for all through joint efforts. We should follow common and cooperative security instead of unilateral and absolute security. The security of one country cannot be compromised at the expense of the security of others, and regional security cannot be guaranteed by strengthening military blocs. We should guard against any attempts of a new Cold War and create a security architecture featuring fairness, justice, joint efforts, and shared benefits. Third, we should build a world of common prosperity through win-win cooperation. We should promote open and inclusive development. Sanction and economic globalization should not be used as weapons. Countries should work together and strengthen policy coordination to avoid protectionism. We should uphold an open, inclusive, and balanced world economy to bring benefits to all. Fourth, we should build an open and inclusive world through exchanges and mutual learning. We should promote the common values of peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom, not allow one civilization to prevail over another. People from different civilizations, social systems, and development paths should draw on each other to achieve common progress. Fifth, we should make our world clean and beautiful by pursuing green and low-carbon development. We should jointly deal with environmental challenges by pursuing balanced and sustainable development. Countries should follow the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, take the opportunity of working together to fight against the pandemic, and advocate green and low-carbon production and lifestyle so as to advance the UN 2030 agenda for a sustainable development. Dear friends, as President Xi Jinping pointed out, in the midst of a global crisis, countries are not on more than 190 small boats, but on one big boat with a shared future. Only when nations pull together, not against each other, and encourage each other, not blame each other, can we overcome the challenges of today and move toward a brighter future. In the face of the volatile international situation, China pursues a new vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. It adheres to a political system of regional hotspots issues and plays a constructive role in maintaining international peace and security. In the face of a sluggish recovery of the world economy, China pursues the concept of common development and promotes high-quality cooperation of the Belt and Road construction, which is green, open, clean, high-standard, sustainable, and beneficial to the people. In the face of complex governance difficulties, China has actively participated in the building of global systems for climate, environment, health, and digital governance, pushed for globalization to be more open and win-win for all, and firmly upheld the international system with international nations at its core and international order based on international law. In the face of the impact of COVID-19 on the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, China has put forward a global development initiative calling on all countries to take action and inject new impetus into the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Dear friends, as the China old saying goes, a public spirit will rule all under the heaven when the great awe prevails. When spring comes, vegetation grows and spreads, and the mountain scenery in spring will be enjoyed. Peace and development are the theme of our times, and irrestrainable trend of history as well. In the face of common challenges facing mankind, countries should strengthen solidarity instead of estrangement, promote cooperation instead of provoking conflicts, and join hands to build community with a shared future for mankind. We should make positive contributions to the political settlement of international and regional issues and the maintenance of world peace and stability. Once again, I want to thank President Helga and friends from Schiller Institute for inviting me to attend the conference. It is significant and pertinent to prove wisdom to seek for common development of human beings and build a community with a shared future for mankind at this critical moment. Wish conference a complete success. Thank you.
And thank you. We have just heard from Chen Xiaohan, representing the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, speaking on a shared future for mankind. Our next presenter is Alessia Ruggeri, proud trade unionist and spokeswoman of the Comitato per la Repubblica. The topic is For a Europe of the Fatherlands with the Peace of Westphalia.
Right now, the world is suffering from a bad lack of democracy, trust, and increasing confusion. Citizens no longer recognize themselves in political institutions, and there is no longer trust between states themselves. In an increasingly connected world, we witness increasingly fragmented societies and the erosion of democracy in the West. As an Italian, I experienced the nightmare of being subjected to political choices that I believe are detrimental to the security of my country and the achievement of the peace we all desire. I have witnessed appeals for peace addressed to Russia by our political leaders while they were at the same time sending weapons to Ukraine. Even among the humanitarian aid and the airport of Pisa, they have discovered clandestine weapons, and the airport trade unions refused to load them on the planes. Invoking peace while at the same time sending weapons is like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. The Draghi government has decided to allocate 2% of GDP for the purchase of weapons and to align itself totally with the EU choices. This is while in Europe country companies are closing down, and for years there has been no investment in research, in schools, in hospitals, and the real economy. As a trade unionist, I represent thousands of small entrepreneurs throughout the country who had to close their business. And while the Italian parliament approves the sending of weapons to Ukraine, which violates our constitution, the large majority of Italians, as shown by polls, we are against rearmament and hope instead for an economic policy that will promote employment. It is necessary to make a distinction between the real economy and the financial one. The financial one represents the speculative bubble that moves the great ones of the heart and that has nothing to do with the citizens. The real one is us, the enterprises that are the backbone of the economy. As for the foreign policy of our government, and unfortunately also of the other European governments, it seems that everyone has forgotten the promise made by the NATO member states after the fall of the Berlin Wall to then Soviet leader Gorbachev, in which they undertook not to expand even an inch further east than Germany. We had to even witness that the leaders of the NATO member countries repeatedly denied this agreement and were obviously refuted after that. Also, the trilateral agreement of Minsk was deliberately not respected and buried before Putin recognized the two separatist republics. I had to shamefully witness the following statement of an Italian daily. Ukraine-Russia war, when killing Putin is the only solution. I did not see any statement of outrage for this call to assassinate Putin, and not even for the massacre in Odessa, in which 48 people were burned to death, including a pregnant woman. I welcomed with great enthusiasm the call of the Schiller Institute to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations, inspired by the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia put an end to 30 years of bloody warfare between Catholics and Protestants. In a delicate moment, it is necessary to take as reference the model of the Europe of the Fatherlands, of de Gaulle and the Peace of Westphalia. Someone called the general a saboteur, attributing to him the will to hinder those who worked for European integration. On the contrary, de Gaulle was a convinced Europhile, but he rejected the creation of supranational structure that would lead to federalism. In fact, today we can say that the European Union has deprived over time each member state of its sovereignty. The Europe of the Fatherlands wanting to be a force that stood autonomously between the United States and the Soviet Union, and not a Europe resulting from the progressive loss of sovereignty of the states. In short, a Europe independent from the Atlantic and the Soviet blocs, able to take decisions independently. On this day, I want to remember two Italians, the mayor of Florence, La Pira, and Pope John XXIII, when in the 60s they helped to create a bridge between East and West to preserve peace, and evoking that spirit and the encyclical Pacem in Terris. I address myself as did the pontiff to all men of goodwill, invoking a world of peace without blocks, a Europe of the Fatherlands with the Peace of Westphalia is not a utopia, but a project that should inspire anyone who truly wants peace. I would like to thank once again the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
And thank you, Alessia. It was Alessia Ruggeri of the Comitato per la Repubblica. We're now going to go to our discussion period. Ambassador P.S. Raghavan of India is unable to be with us for our session. And so what we're going to do is to bring everyone up for the discussion. And what we're going to do is just go in the very same order that people spoke and ask for your comments on all that you have heard or anything that you'd like to raise. So Helga, we'd like to begin with you first.
Well, I first want to thank all the speakers on this panel, and the fact that we all come from different parts of the planet and bring our different cultural traditions and experiences. I think this is a very encouraging sign, because I think, what unites us all is the recognition that mankind has reached a point where we do need a change in the policies, and that together we have to search for the principles which make it possible to arrive at that new paradigm. And, for me, this is starting with the image of man, because, once you agree on what you would call in religious terms the sacredness of human life, and for those who are not religious, you can call it the inviolability of the human life, because what makes man unique is, the ability, and I think Sam Pitroda alluded to it, the ability of man to develop new science and technology. And this is what constitutes humanity as the only creative species which we know of. There may be other species, when we explore the universe, but right now it's the only species we know. And it is that recognition of the creative nature of the human being which gives us hope that we can find a solution. And, the great philosopher of the 15th century, Nicolaus of Cusa, who is known in Russia as Nicola Kosansky, he established this idea of the coincidence of opposites, that there is a solution for every problem because the one has a higher order than the many. And that is also the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, that the one humanity is of a higher order than all particular, national interests or other interests. So I would like to thank again the participants in this panel, and would like to, give the word to all of you.
Thank you, Helga.
Thank you, Helga.
Ambassador Antonov, very happy to see you at the very intense period, as you know. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. You see that I don't consider that I waste my time on Saturday. It's a great pleasure for me to be with my friends, with the new faces whom I don't know and I would like to confirm my thanks to Schiller Institute and Helga Zepp-LaRouche for this opportunity to share my view on a very important and pressing issue that we have discussed today. It's very interesting to listen participants from 4 continents. I see one denominator that everybody is concerned by current situation. Nobody is satisfied what is going on, and we see so many problems we can solve. And it's very important that today I come to conclusion that nobody outside can give us any solution. Neither United States nor Russia. You see that we are just a member of international community, and it's very important for us to sit together and to discuss all outstanding issues. But I would like to confirm an importance for NGO to be involved in this process. I'm sure that without your assistance, it will be very difficult to find a compromise which fits everybody. So again, I would like to confirm my readiness to participate in any of your events, and it will be a great honor for me to welcome you in our embassy if and when you find an opportunity to come to Washington. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wish good luck everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Pitroda.
Thank you. I first want to compliment Helga for her leadership in putting this conference together. I think we should see this as a beginning of a new process and not just one event. I am convinced that war must stop. Destroying properties, killing of people is not the answer. We must get at the table to solve the problem, to save lives, and bring peace to the area, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. I believe the key is to focus on redesigning the world. It is not a piece of conversation. We got to get it done. And it has to move away from power and profit to planet and people. Environmental blunders get less attention today than we need. We also need to get off this command and control architecture. Take advantage of hyperconnectivity and begin new conversation with focus on collaboration, cooperation, co-creation. There is enough for everybody in this world. Why do we need to fight? Can we take humanity to the next level by focusing on hyperconnectivity to create new order? And that's what I would like to see. I'm 80-year-old and I know I have very little time. And I also know that very few people would listen to someone like me. Because there is a golden rule in this world. One who has gold makes the rule. And that has to change. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. J. Naidu.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Helga and the Schiller Institute to convening this conversation. You know, I take heed of the fact that we are all conscious of the multiple crises we are facing the world. You know, 1 billion people will go to bed hungry today. You know, there are countries across Africa and the world, including in Middle East, where millions of people are starving, have been living in countries embroiled in civil war, often stoked by interests that come from beyond their countries. We are living in a situation where we've recreated the scenario of the Second World War, with practically 60 million people either refugees or displaced because of internal conflicts, because of interstate conflicts. And that's something we should leave behind. You know, as Mahatma Gandhi said, there's more than enough in this world to meet all our needs, but not enough to meet our greed. So we do need a new architecture, not just of security, but a new architecture of development, of understanding that as a humanity, we have no dominion over this world. We live by the grace and the blessings of Mother Earth. Therefore, we need to respect her and put the environment at the center of all our debates and our discussions, whether that's political, economic, social, because I come from a point of view, which is most people in the world, that everything is sacred. All life is sacred. One life is not more important than another life. One part of our world is not more important than another part of the world. And therefore I reiterate and I endorse the fact that what Sam and many of you have said, to move from a situation of power, of greed, of arrogance, to a situation where we regard ourselves as part of an international community, as part of nature, not apart from her, where we live in harmony, where we live with tolerance, and where we deal with the devastating impact of war on our countries. And I really would like to appeal that we're not constructing one big forum. In fact, the approach to global peace, a transformative peace, is building a network of networks where everyone has a right to have a say, including Mother Earth. That there are such things as the rights of our planet, and that we cannot construct a world any longer where the only rights that are respected are the rights of human beings. So I embrace the idea that there needs to be a bottom-up process that galvanizes the 7.5 billion people in our world towards a new narrative where there is no master, where there is no policeman, where there is no attempt of domination by one over the other. And coming out of South Africa, which has been a pariah for many, many, many hundreds of years, I would argue that the time for the evolution of a consciousness, of a new civilization that recognizes the importance of all. And that as Africa, we want to come out of the shadow of the past 500 years of slavery, of colonization, and of a brutal form of exploitation, and take our rightful place in the community of nations. We are the cradle of humanity. We have many things to say as the people and the continent that produced the earliest tools that led us to where we are. Music, education, language, agriculture. So we think that we need to create the opportunity in a context where young people do not trust political institutions. They do not even trust governments or big business or even established civil society. We are talking about a grassroots conversation that allows the burgeoning, the unfurling of a new way in which we learn to live together in love, in tolerance, and in harmony. And that's the prayer. That's the prayer I have. As a grandfather, as an elder, I recognize what I've gone through, and I stand alongside people saying the time has come for a new paradigm of development that brings us together as a humanity in relation and in an intelligent collaboration with all the other species we share Mother Earth with. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Alessia, we're coming to you, but I just want to say that we have to do a consecutive translation. So when you speak, we're going to have to hear the translation. So please pause so we can make sure we're following what you're saying.
Alessia?
Ok, allora accolgo, sì. Allora accolgo l'invito dell'ambasciatore Antonov, che stimo, per raggiungere l'ambasciata in segno di solidarietà da italiana e da europea. Abbiamo avuto, noi italiani, l'incubo di essere associati ad una politica prima italiana e poi europea che non rispecchia la volontà di noi che siamo il popolo, di noi che rappresentiamo la classe imprenditoriale italiana. Noi prendiamo le distanze dalle scelte governative e politiche del nostro governo e siamo in tanti. Noi riconosciamo nella Russia un'alleata, un'amica con cui l'Italia ha avuto per diversi anni un rapporto serio.
Could you pause for a moment because we have to have the interpretation?
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me in English? Yes.
Yes.
All right. I welcome the invitation which Ambassador Antonov made to some of the speakers to come to the Russian embassy in Washington. And I would like to do that as an Italian and as an European to express my solidarity. Italy and Europe have, in the recent years, had policies which do not at all reflect the will of the people, and we are taking distance as a trade union, as an entrepreneurs from such policies. And in particularly, we do recognize that Russia is a friend and an ally for Italy.
Okay. Sono d'accordo con il mio collega dell'Africa, del Sudafrica, che ogni parte del mondo ha la stessa importanza. Sono le persone che devono essere al centro di questa nuova architettura, che deve promuovere, oltre alla sicurezza, lo sviluppo dei paesi, soprattutto del Sudafrica che rappresenta. Ringrazio.
Aspetta, facciamo frasi brevi, se no si annoiano. I agree also with the speaker from South Africa that every part of the world and every person has the same importance in this new security and development architecture, and that the key question is the development, in this case, of Africa.
Ringrazio Helga Zepp-LaRouche per questa opportunità da italiana e mi impegno ad essere in Italia e non solo parte attiva affinché questa nuova architettura possa nel breve tempo possibile raggiungere il primo obiettivo, che è quello di una serena cooperazione tra gli stati che vorranno farne parte.
I thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche for this opportunity. As an Italian, I will be an active part of the movement to move towards this new architecture. And I hope that we can, as soon as possible, reach the first aim of this proposal, which is the cooperation among nations.
Okay, well, thank you. Helga, what I just want to say to everyone, we're getting many questions. Of course, we're going to keep it as a kind of discussion process because there's so many. I'll just indicate the character of what we're getting, much of which, of course, is also for the ambassador, which is people are asking about this point that was made a few times, particularly by Sam Pitroda, about the post-World War II world, post-Franklin Delano Roosevelt world, we call it in America, and the institutions that were created then but have not been recreated since. There were remarks, reflections about the Bandung Conference of 1955 and its importance and whether there's anything that several of the speakers might have to say about that. And then there's sort of a very specific area of questions which have to do with the lost chance, what Helga has called before, the lost chance of 1989, what happened at the time when it looked like, you know, the Cold War was over and there was going to be a collaboration among people. There's a specific idea that was for Ambassador Antonov just as a whole, which is we recall the collaboration of the American and Russian people in defeating Nazism and world fascism during World War II, what was called the Spirit of the Elba. We recall the joint Apollo-Soyuz space mission in the midst of the Cold War, and what steps can be taken to revive that spirit even in the midst of this terrible crisis. So that's the character of what we're getting. So Helga, I'm going to ask you to first respond first as a whole, and then, of course, everyone will be able to do the same.
Well, I agree with Sam that, and also Alessia, who said it, that we need a movement. That this conference is very important because it brings together people from, maybe 5 continents, 4 continents, and there were many, many people who registered. And I know that we have live streams going on of different media, that there are commitments of people who have promised that they will distribute the proceedings of this conference afterwards to as many people as possible. So I foresee that we will have a process of such building of a movement, which will be extremely important, because what we touched upon in these brief presentations, unfortunately, we are in a period where everything will get worse in the short term. Hopefully we can, contribute to bring negotiations back on the table in respect to the Ukraine situation. But even beyond that, we are in a breakdown crisis of a financial system. The danger to 1 billion people is intolerable. I mean, when the pandemic broke out, my immediate response was to say that this must be the beginning of building a world health system, a modern health system in every single country. That has not happened because, the institutions which have the power, they did what they did, but they did not go to the roots of the problem, namely that it is the underdevelopment of the developing countries and therefore the lack of a health system which makes pandemics possible. I think China has demonstrated very efficiently that once you have a modern health system, you can contain even a pandemic. So the need to build a health system in every country is still there. But I think we also have the urgent need to prevent that 1 billion people is dying of starvation. This is completely intolerable. So I would, hope that out of this conference comes a commitment that, that everything is done to prevent the starvation of so many people. Because, that would say something about ourselves, that if we cannot mobilize to save 1 billion people of 8 billion or less than 8 billion, then we are morally not fit. So I think the idea of the sacredness of every life, and that there is no difference between the value of a life, let it be in Europe or in Africa or in China or in the United States or wherever, all lives should be regarded as equally sacred. And therefore, to combat the famine, to combat the pandemic, must be the starting point of overcoming the underdevelopment of all. And that is what I think must be an ongoing theme of hopefully a large growing movement of people who demand a new paradigm.
Okay. Ambassador Antonov, any thoughts?
I have so much thoughts, you see, that I'm scared to keep you listening me for the whole day. Of course, first of all, you see that in 1 month and a half, all of us, we will celebrate the great victory in Second World War. We will never forget 25th of April, when the Soviet and American soldiers embraced an Elbe River. We will never forget how we fought together. You cannot imagine how many lives we lost. As I know that United States lost about 500,000, and today I already mentioned that the Soviet Union lost 27 million. Should we give anybody any opportunity to forget about those days, about disasters where we survived together. And it seems to me that we shouldn't give any right to anybody to give another history, how Nazi came into power and how we destroyed Nazi together with United States, UK, and other nations. We have excellent experience after the Second World War, especially in strategic stability area. We have created so many important legally binding documents that met interest of United States and Russian people. And we already started strategic dialogue with the current administration, but due to some problems, it is frozen now. I would like to draw your attention. We have some core legally binding documents that United States and Russia are in favor, such as NPT, START Treaty. We shouldn't give any opportunity to undercut those treaties. And more important, I'm sure that we are doomed with the United States to cooperate on all strategic issues. Just only some of them: fighting against coronavirus, climate change. We have a lot of common regarding activities in Arctic, cybersecurity. It's new challenge to the security of United States and Russia. And we started fruitful dialogue on this issue. I hope that time will come when Russian and American experts will sit together and they will restart fruitful cooperation. Even under such difficult circumstances, we continue space cooperation between the United States and Russia. And I hope that maybe it will be a little bridge that will permit us to foster our cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Yes. Sam?
Thank you. No, I am convinced that the problems of the world cannot be solved in the existing global organizational architecture. We have been talking about eliminating hunger for 50 years. World Bank has had many, many programs. We haven't been able to do that. We've been talking about eliminating poverty, improving environment. So look at the track record. And you will realize that very few have become very rich and lots of people have suffered in this world. The inequality has increased in spite of democratization of knowledge and technology becoming pervasive. We need a new architecture. And I think if we have single-minded focus for next 5-10 years that we want to redesign the world, nothing short of that will solve the problem. Helga talked about health system. It is part of the problem. Education, food, environment, water. These are all global challenges, and it cannot be handled on a piecemeal basis. So if we collectively decide to focus on one basic challenge, and that is to redesign the world's architecture, relook at UN. Do we need World Bank? Do we need IMF? What does it mean to have a financial system that we have today? Do we need a new financial system? How do we use hyperconnectivity to change all this? I think we are just underestimating the power of hyperconnectivity, the opportunity to innovate. What is going on in Silicon Valley and other parts of the world in technology is going to have huge impact on humanity. And that requires new organizational architecture. I wrote this book because I felt that without addressing larger issues. Micromanagement is not possible. And I hope we can make this a movement globally to redesign the world. Then something will happen in maybe 5-10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay? I think you're muted.
Jay, you are muted.
Oh, now you're good. I think you're good. Go ahead.
For the last 2.5 decades, I have collaborated with Sam Pitroda. I was then the Minister of Telecommunications in the Mandela government. And we saw this technological revolution as a tremendous advance towards a new humanity. In fact, it was the leveling of the playing field, the basic need of all other basic needs. We could deliver telemedicine, we could deliver information, we should deliver government services, all seamlessly. And so the internet was one of the greatest discoveries and innovations of humanity. But today, we know this internet is controlled by gigantic companies that have wrenched away our right to access information, to access knowledge, to access the true news, not just fake news. We are now being censored across social media. So, one of the greatest inventions of human, intelligence has now been captured. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Many of the institutions that we created after the Second World War was with the intention to stop war, to build global peace, and that global development was the flip side of conflict. So how is it that 70 years later, we have 1 billion people going to bed hungry? We have close to 60 million people displaced. We have, in the COVID pandemic and the way it was managed, it ended up as control and command system, where our rights were taken away from us. And so, the question really one wants to ask is what's happened? For 70 years, these institutions today do not have the trust of the majority of our people. Institutions at a micro level, in every sector of society, in the global architecture. So they are not fit for purpose. The one thing we know about the technological digital revolution is things are changing at a dramatic pace. The world has changed in the last 2 years, given how we've approached the issue of a COVID pandemic, how it's entrenched the power, particularly of big pharma in our world. And so what we have to talk about is, yes, a redesign of the global architecture for everything. And how do we construct the bridge between the old and the new? What are the principles of that? Where do we look for what we've done in the past? And that's where I do want to go back to the issue of the Bandung Conference. Because in 1955, it met to promote a notion of Afro-Asian solidarity, economic and cultural cooperation, the idea that, we can create a new world away from colonialism or neocolonialism. We met again in 2005. But I think today there needs to be a new Bandung of all of us, so that we can all have an input into what is the design of the new world we all want to see. We have all argued in this conference. At the same time, the non-aligned movement was created in 1961. The idea that we didn't want to be pulled into proxy wars between global powers. Of course, that non-aligned movement lost its momentum in the context of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union and what's happened since then. So in a sense, I think for countries that do not hold that global power, we do want to see a new non-aligned movement. We do want an opinion, because the majority of people live in countries that have historically been part of the non-aligned movement. And lastly, I would say the Non-Proliferation Treaty on nuclear weapons, and all the agreements we've had from the time that the Cold War formally ended in 1990 need to be put back on the board and to be put back in the center of our conversations so that we can remove the root causes of why we are at this moment back where we hope that we would never be, with the threat of conventional war, of a new arms race, of a potential nuclear winter. So I think that, these are the conversations where ultimately, they say democracy is when governments and those in power are afraid of the people, and totalitarianism is where people are afraid of the governments. We as the people need to reclaim our power away from politicians, many who have been captured by vested interests of a military-industrial complex. Thank you.
Okay, and Alessia, before, in addition to your general remarks, we have a particular question which I'm going to pose to you, which came from the Italian blog Database Italia. And they ask you, the Schiller Institute promotes an international debate for humanitarian aid, a new peace security architecture that can replace the failed NATO political and military machine. Do you think that we will finally see this new paradigm, which can guarantee international aid and a mutual support society?
Questa è la domanda di Database Italia a te, Alessia, se vuoi rispondere. Devi togliere mute.
Io credo che la NATO si basi su un paradigma economico, sociale, politico ormai obsoleto. C'è un'esigenza.
Traduco. I believe that NATO is based on an economic and social paradigm which is totally obsolete.
Ok. Vi è un'esigenza fisiologica di una nuova architettura che possa parlare innanzitutto di inclusione e non esclusione, di inclusione e di un ponte tra i diversi mondi che rappresentiamo noi qui oggi, tra i relatori, di un dialogo che metta al centro le persone, che metta al centro le competenze, per un'architettura che metta al centro gli interessi e la tutela di ogni singola nazione che deciderà di aderire.
And there is a physiological need for this new architecture, which is made of inclusion and a bridge between different worlds, as represented by the ones of the speakers today, and then allows a dialogue between competent people instead of people who have brought us to rule. Ok.
Concludo dicendo che per quello che riguarda me e la classe imprenditoriale che rappresento, migliaia di imprenditori, faremo di tutto quello che è possibile nelle nostre possibilità a promuovere questa nuova architettura e a dare voce anche a quegli italiani e quegli europei che non si riconoscono più nelle politiche comunitarie dell'Unione Europea.
And in conclusion, as far as I'm concerned, as a trade unionist representing thousands of small entrepreneurs in Italy, I'm committing myself in this conference to do my best to create this new architecture, and also to give a voice to those Italians and Europeans who are not represented anymore by the European Union.
Okay, well, thank you. We just have a few moments left, and we're going to ask for each speaker to give a 1-minute sort of summary of anything they'd like to say before we conclude, and we're going to do it in reverse order. So we'll start with you, Alessia, and then proceed backwards.
Cominciamo da te, Alessia, per un ordine inverso. Un commento finale di 1 minuto.
Niente, il mio commento vorrei ribadire la mia riconoscenza ad Helga, perché dà voce a tanti italiani che al momento non si sentono rappresentati da nessuno. È chiaro che noi vogliamo la pace. Questa nuova architettura addirittura si rifà alla pace di Westfalia che mise fine ad una lotta prima di 30 anni e poi di 80 anni in Europa. Noi vogliamo la pace e vogliamo che ci siano le condizioni per poterla realizzare, ovviamente.
My final comment is that I want to thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is courageously giving a voice to all those Europeans and Italians who want peace, and they want a peace based on the concept of the Peace of Westphalia, which put an end to 30 years of war. And we want a Europe which is contributing to peace and not to war.
Thank you. Jay Naidu.
Thank you very much to the Schiller Institute and to Helga and Sam and convening this conference and your moderation. You know, I'm reminded that, you know, at what Mandela often said to us, that at the end of every war, you will have to sit around the table and talk about peace. And when he was asked, when he left the prison after 27 years of being on Robben Island and Victor Verster, prison, you know, if he had any revenge in his heart, and his reply was very profound. And he said that if I leave this prison with revenge in my heart, then I will still be a prisoner. And so I hope that through this conversation that we're having, that we agree that every voice counts, and that in the conversations we are having to get us out of this crossroads, because the jury is out on whether we as humanity have earned the right to be on this Mother Earth, then I hope that every voice will count, and we will ask who's not in the room, whose voice are we not hearing? And often we would find it is the voice of ordinary people, of unemployed youth in Africa, of smallholder farmers, subsistence farmers at the epicenter of hunger in Africa, which still has 2/3 of the cultivatable arable land in the world that is now being taken away from us by other governments, other companies from outside of Africa. I hope that we will include young people, that we will include the gay and LGBTQ communities, that will include smaller countries that are facing the crisis of climate change, and whether they will continue to exist as small island states, of people that live in areas that are bordering on seas that are below sea level. I hope that we can bring ourselves to a consensus that the most important thing now is not war. It's not another arms race. It's not another nuclear threats against each other. That we can step down from the arrogance of big men, find an intelligent cooperation between the feminine and the masculine, and build a cooperation across these divisions we call states, and understand that we are, like someone said, in one boat, not in 190 boats. And I hope that this will be what we take away from this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sam Pitroda.
Thank you. I agree with Jay. Jay had said it in a very forceful way. I would like to use this conference to plant seeds to redesign the world. I would like to use this conference not just to have a conversation on NATO, Russia, Ukraine, US, military, security. I want to use this to plant seeds for taking humanity to the next level. And that would require totally new thinking. In that thinking, people and planet will have to be at the center, and hyperconnectivity and technology would offer us the hope and opportunities that mankind never had before. I am very bullish on innovations, creativity possible today to solve the problems of the humanity. I believe we can produce anything today. We need to decide what is that we want to produce and for whom do we want to produce. I believe we can eliminate hunger. I believe we can reduce and completely eliminate poverty. I believe we can attain peace, but that will require completely different mindset. And I'm worried about the mindset of the people. I'm worried about hypocrisy. I'm worried about power-hungry politicians. I'm worried about profit-hungry industrialists, corporations. And I'm worried about the fact that we have lost empathy, values, characters. We want to steal from others. We want to fight to gain more. And we really need a new mindset. We need Gandhian mindset. At the end of the day, truth, trust, love, inclusion, diversity, environment, respect, dignity, education, health, food matter. How do we get people to focus on this as opposed to truth today is converted into lies? Trust is converted into mistrust. Love is converted into hate. We cannot go on like this. We got to redesign the world. And I'm looking to work on this for whatever little time I have left. I'm very bullish. I'm very hopeful. And I hope we can use today's event to plant the right seeds to redesign the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Antonov.
First, thank you very much again for such opportunity to deal with these very important issues. For me, I pay special attention on everybody's statement today, because everybody has a right to flag an issue that he is interested in. And of course, I cannot disagree with an idea to do our utmost to take humanity to a next step of development. For me, I see so many issues we have to tackle together, and my dear colleagues have mentioned them. As an ambassador, of course, I would like to emphasize the necessity for political dialogue between nations. I'm sure that without compromise on this issue, it would be not possible for us to make any step ahead. In the end of my remarks today, I would like to draw again and again to the Russian idea that we have to restore a principle of indivisible security for everybody. It seems to me that each man and a woman has a right to be equally treated, as well as each nation, each national interest of any country has to be taken into account. Without such understanding, it will be very difficult to think about a new system of international security. So you see that, again, thank you very much for this opportunity to explain where we are, what kind of problems we face, and I'm ready to cooperate with you with the great interest. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Helga?
I think the idea that we need new institutions because the old ones have become either obsolete, like NATO, or the IMF because it did not solve the poverty issue. I think that that is one outcome of this discussion. Now, we already have the experience of working with the non-aligned movement because my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, came back from a trip in Iraq in '75, and he recognized that the IMF was obsolete then, and he proposed the International Development Bank, which was the idea to create a credit institution which would facilitate technology transfer to the developing countries on a grand scale. And for one full year, the LaRouche movement of that time, we worked with all the governments of the non-aligned movement, and the IDB was almost word by word in the final resolution of the Colombo Conference of the non-aligned movement in Sri Lanka in 1976. So what happened was, that despite the fact that 3/4 of the human species had demanded a just new world economic order in this Colombo resolution, there was an onslaught whereby many of the leaders got either assassinated, like Ali Bhutto, or destabilized, like Mrs. Gandhi and Mrs. Bandaranaike from Sri Lanka. So we have a long experience of what you are up against when you are trying to change the world order. But I think right now we are at a new point, because there is no way how this international financial system will last very long. We are in a hyperinflationary blowout, whereby you will not get this inflation under control, and any effort to pump more liquidity, to make more quantitative easing, to pull more trillions into the system. I mean, we have now in the transatlantic system a situation like what we had in Germany in 1923, when the hyperinflation exploded within a few months and the system came to an end. So that will demand that the question of a new credit system is being put on the agenda. And that must be in a cooperation between governments, because governments finally, have to do it. But it also is a question of, individuals, of social forces demanding a just world economic order, which allows for the development of all people on this planet. So I think the issues, which we touch upon today, are becoming very clear. We do need an international security architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet, because there is an indivisible security, and we will not have peace if you leave out any part of the world. So this approach will require, most of all, not only empathy. Friedrich Schiller, according to whom the Schiller Institute is called, said Empfindungsvermögen, which is sort of a empathy, but love is really the better word. Schiller said the development of the Empfindungsvermögen of love, of compassion, is the most important requirement of our time. And I think that is also, what must come out of it. This is why in the Peace of Westphalia, the idea that foreign policy from now on had to be based on love was a very practical issue, and not a utopian idea at all. Because if we do not come to the point that we love mankind, we will not solve anything. And Confucius and also Lessing said that if you decide to feel love, you can switch your feeling to do that. And this is a subject of a whole other discussion. But you can force yourself to love instead of hate, because once you relate to the other person that you want the best for the other person and the other nation, which is the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, then it changes your emotions. You can switch from hate to love by doing something for the other. And so I think that we are on a good track, and I think this will have a very important function to shape history in the next period.
Thank you, Helga. We'd like to thank our panelists, Alessia Ruggeri, J. Naidoo, Sam Pitroda, Ambassador Anatoly Antonov. And we also like to thank a couple of people who were not able to be here for the discussion: Chen Xiaohan of the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, and Ambassador P.S. Raghavan. And we, of course, like to thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche for putting this together. We'd like to thank all of you for participating. And we're now going to conclude this section of our conference and go to panel 2, which will be moderated by the Vice Chairman of the Schiller Institute, Harley Schlanger. Hello there, Harley.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you. Let me welcome people to the second panel of the Schiller Institute Conference on establishing a new security and financial architecture for all nations. In this panel, we're going to take up the urgent need for a new economic financial platform to replace the present neoliberal global system. Long before the present crisis in Ukraine, this system was undergoing a protracted and accelerating collapse, resulting from the policies imposed by the beneficiaries of this order. In this panel, we'll look at what must be done to move from this collapsing system to establish economic relations based on cooperation between sovereign nation states. Now, after the presentations, we hope to have an opportunity for questions. I would urge all speakers to keep to your allocated time of about 10 minutes to allow time for an open discussion. We're going to begin with Dennis Small, who is the Ibero-American editor of the Executive Intelligence Review and the lead author of a Schiller Institute policy paper, The LaRouche Plan for a New International Economic Architecture. And Dennis's presentation will be titled The New Architecture, a program to prevent the starvation of 1 billion people due to the sanctions. Dennis?
Thanks, Harley. I'm very glad to be here today among this distinguished group of international thoughtful actors or active thinkers who are gathered to come up with solutions to the world problems. And the problems are great indeed. I'm reminded of what Ramsey Clark once said about what made Lyndon LaRouche so dangerous to his enemies in the international financial establishment is that his organization was a fertile engine of ideas. And it is again today exactly that which makes us so much of a threat to the existing financial establishment centered in London with an important branch in Wall Street. And it is now urgent that we rev up those engines to deal with a crisis of a magnitude that we haven't seen since the 14th century Black Death, if then. We're looking down the barrel of the gun of world famine, for example, which, whereas just a few months ago, the estimates were 235, 250 million people would be dying of starvation over the course of this year. Now the best estimates, and they are unfortunately accurate, are that as many as 1 billion people could well die of famine this year. That's 1/8 of the human population. The situation in particular countries, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, are bad because of their extreme dependence on imports. By cutting off Russian and Ukrainian exports, the Russians through these super sanctions, which have been applied, the two countries together have 1/3 of all of the wheat that's traded on the world markets. And again, that hits Africa and the Middle East in particular all the harder. The situation of energy is even worse. That hits Europe particularly hard. Europe is totally dependent on Russian exports of oil and gas. Germany, the most industrialized of the nations of Europe, gets 24% of its entire energy supply from Russian gas and oil, as you can see on the graphic on your screen. But this is not just hitting Africa, it's not just hitting Germany. These super sanctions coming on top of an ongoing collapse of the entire global financial system is hitting the entire world. What we're now dealing with, as you can see by looking at Lyndon LaRouche's famous triple curve function, which gives an idea of the relationship of the growth of financial speculative assets and the physical economic collapse underneath that, you can see that this problem actually began with collapsing rates of growth of the physical economy back approximately in 1971, when the floating exchange rate system was introduced internationally. The fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods, established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was scuttled. And that opened the doors to a tidal wave of speculation, which today has created a bubble of derivatives, which is anywhere between $1.5 and $2 quadrillion. Now, what's happened, as you can see on the second version of this triple curve, is that on top of this ongoing collapse, what we have had is a ratchet down with a pandemic, which caused terrible crisis throughout the world. On top of that, a further ratchet down by the intentional deindustrialization instituted coming off the COP26 meeting and the environmentalist program generally internationally. And then now a third ratchet down of a dramatic sort with these sanctions which have been put in place internationally. So since 1971, when the floating exchange rate system was established, that was the beginning of the end of what in fact was the Glass-Steagall system internationally, which separated productive uses of currency and credit from speculative activities. On the international scale, we're talking about the fixed exchange rate system. Within the United States, it's Glass-Steagall. It's the same thing in terms of economic fundamentals. Now, let me turn to the question of how do we solve this problem, because I think that's really where our attention and our discussion must focus. We have put together a program to address this crisis globally, to create a new economic architecture premised on LaRouche's basic economic policy centered around his 4 laws. Now, the thing that you start with, and you always have to start with this, is the physical economy. Not financial aspects, but the physical economy. If you look at the combination of Russia, India, and China, what Primakov called the strategic triangle, you can see that these 3 nations alone, all of whom are being attacked and destroyed by the speculative assaults from London and from Washington, and the political assaults and the military assaults as well. But these 3 nations combined have 38% of the world's population. They produce 42% of the wheat, 66% of the steel, of the new nuclear plants being built, 45%. It's not like they could function in an autarkical fashion, but they have a very good basis for breaking with the speculative system and establishing, and this is our second point of our proposal, a common currency beginning among these nations, which would establish a fixed exchange rate among them and with an absolute barrier between them and the speculative dollar system. Now, there has been much discussion already in financial circles internationally of how you would do this. Would it be backed by gold, by commodities, by what? The key thing that makes a currency worth something is if it is backed by actual credit, which is issued in a productive direction. And I'd like to quote for you what Lyndon LaRouche said about this in a June 29th, 2005 seminar in Berlin. He said, the popular conception of money by governments and by leading institutions is insane by the standards of the effect of the concept and the way it's applied. The value of money should be determined by a scientific principle, not an accounting principle. And the scientific principle is, what is a physically defensible determination of the will of governments and the ability of governments to perform in creating credit over the long term for the development of their economies and their productivities? Knowledge of the determination and competence of the government to create value, to create wealth, and to have sufficient wealth to repay the debt you are creating in a timely fashion. This is a physical question, not an accounting question. And I think this is essential to the task of putting together such a common block and a currency to back it up in terms of its physical economic capabilities. Third is nations that are part of this salvaging of their physical economies by breaking with the sinking Titanic have to establish national currencies with fixed exchange rates, not a floating exchange rate, which opens the door to speculation with the dollar, and to defend that with exchange controls. Use that to establish Hamiltonian credit issued towards productive activities of exactly the sort that Lyndon LaRouche was just describing. The need for such a complete wall between the speculative economy and the productive economy is at the heart of a Glass-Steagall type of arrangement. With that in place as a building block or a starting point, we then have the requirement of those three RIC nations, which remember were the start of the BRIC after the RIC, and then the BRICS. They should expand by lending capital for productive activities for third world development, the developing sector. And most nations of the developing sector will be very happy to join such an arrangement because they're being killed, and literally killed, by the policies of the sinking, self-destructing transatlantic financial system. It's extremely important, as a fifth point, for this type of a new arrangement to be offered to the United States and to the nations of Europe. This is what Lyndon LaRouche had always proposed, a four-power agreement of Russia, India, China, and the United States, where around proposals such as the Belt and Road Initiative of China, the offer is made to the United States and to Europe to join that activity, which of course will benefit not Wall Street, not the City of London, but it will benefit the population and the industry of that entire region. It's not such a huge change for the United States. It means only going back to the principles of Alexander Hamilton on which our American system of political economy was in fact founded. And finally, in sixth, we propose that this new orientation, this approach of East-West cooperation for development, for win-win development, be applied to Ukraine, the hardest problem perhaps on the planet. Ukraine has been destroyed by 30 years of liberal economic policies, not just by the war. And what this has meant is a collapse of its population by a third, a collapse of its labor force, a collapse of its manufacturing labor force by 25%. And this in an economy which had been one of the most advanced, industrial developed with high technology, aerospace and other capabilities, nuclear energy and so on. And of course, the famous Black Earth providing for agricultural capabilities. These all must be rebuilt, and it must be rebuilt with joint cooperation between East and West. And in that fashion, Ukraine will become not the trigger for a potential thermonuclear war, but a reorganization around a Westphalian principle of the benefit of the other being the basis for resolving the problems of the entire planet. We must take on the Ukraine challenge, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Our next speaker, and this is the second panel on the economy of the Schiller Institute conference, if you're just joining us. Our second speaker will be Professor Justin Yifu Lin, who's the Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics, the Dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development, and the Honorary Dean of the School of National Development at Peking University. His topic will be China's Belt and Road Initiative, the rationale and likely impacts. Dr. Lin, welcome to the conference.
Thank you very much. This is a very timely conference in a very challenging time of the world. And I'm honored to be part of the panel and to share with you my own understanding about why China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative and what's the likely impact this new initiative will bring to the world. The reason why China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's because China wants to be responsible stakeholders in the world. Because currently China is the second largest economy in the world, measured by market exchange rate. But if we measure by purchasing power parity, China is the largest economy in the world. And China is also the largest trading country in the world. And very soon, China will be a high-income country. So like other major countries in the world, China should make a contribution to the development of the world, to the development of other countries, like the advanced country, the US, the European country, Japan, they all do the same. And then certainly there's one way for China to make a contribution through the existing global development cooperation architectures. That is to join the IMF, the World Bank, and to increase China's contribution. That was initially China intended to do. So in 2009, at that time, President Hu Jintao reached an agreement with President Obama for China to increase its contribution to IMF, to the World Bank, and certainly China should also increase its voting power in those institutions. There was an agreement, but unfortunately, the agreement was balked by the US Congress, so it could not be implemented. And not only so, even China can increase its contribution through the existing framework. Is that desirable? Maybe questionable. Because after the Second World War, the advanced country already contributed generously $4.6 trillion US, measured by 2007 US dollars purchasing power, to help the developing country to achieve their development. But so far, among about 200 developing economies in the world, only 2 moved from low income to high income. One was South Korea, the other one was Taiwan, China. And in 1960s, there were 101 middle income economies in the world. By the time of 2008, when I became the chief economist and the senior vice president of the World Bank, only 13 of them moved from the middle income to high income. And among those 13, 8 were European countries surrounding Western Europe. That was Portugal, Spain, and Greece. Their income gap with the advanced country were very small to begin with, or oil producing country. The other 5 were Japan and 4 small East Asian dragons, like Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So from this statistic, we can see, even with the generous support from the advanced country, most developing countries in Latin America, in South Asia, in Africa, were trapped in low income or middle income status. They did not improve much. And so if China joined the existing architecture by increasing more money support to that, the result is very likely to be similar. And why the advanced country generously provides so much money, but we cannot get the result of development, of reducing poverty, elimination hungers. I think it was because most of the support from the advanced country today were used in the humanitarian area like education, health. Certainly, no one can say those areas were not important. Well, in the governance, democracy, transparency, no one can argue against those are important. However, those kind of support could not create jobs, could not contribute to the growth, because they were not targeting the bottleneck of job creation, the bottleneck of the growth in the developing country today. And according to the Chinese experiences, we have one saying: if you want to get rich, if the country want to get rich, build the roads first, to improve the infrastructure first. Because if you can improve the infrastructure, then you can adopt modern technology. And if you improve the infrastructure, you can have industrial upgrading and so on. And that was the reason why in 2013, President Xi Jinping, when he visited Kazakhstan in August, he proposed the Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative. And in October the same year, he participated in ASEAN Summit in Indonesia. He proposed 21st century maritime Silk Road and use infrastructure connectivity as a way for the global development cooperation to improve the infrastructure in the developing country as a way to help the development in the developing country. And for this purpose, China proposed to set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it had 57 founding member countries. And now it had 104 member countries. And in terms of member countries, it only next to the World Bank. So the second largest multilateral development institutions. And so far, also 147 countries and 32 international organizations signed cooperation agreement with China to implement this Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's well received because every country sees the needs of releasing the infrastructure bottleneck for the development in their country. And if this initiative can be implemented, I think it's going to be changing the world. Because we all know the 197 member countries of the UN reached an agreement of 2030 agenda. That is the Sustainable Development Goals. And we all know there are 17 goals. Every goals are very important. Zero poverty, zero hunger, good health, and so on. They are all desirable. But how to achieve that? Goal 8, decent job will be essential. If you give decent job to the people, they will have income. Certainly they are not poor. They will buy food. They will no hunger. They will take care of themselves. They will be good health. But how to deliver the decent job to the people? You need to have industrialization. You need to have technological innovation. But to make industrialization possible, technological innovation, adopting the modern technology possible, you need to have the infrastructure. That's the goal 9 of the SDG. And the Belt and Road Initiative will contribute to the improvement of the infrastructure, so allow the country to have modernization, industrialization, and that will bring the decent job to the people. And with the decent job, as I said, then they will have no hunger, no poverty, good health. So I think if we work together to use the Belt and Road Initiative as a new global development cooperation framework, a world free of poverty will be possible. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Lin. And I think that's something that fits in with the work that Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute have been fighting for a long period of time, going back to even before 2013. Now, our next speaker is Syed Naqvi, an Indian journalist, television commentator, and interviewer. And he'll be speaking on an important topic, media role and responsibility. And Mr. Naqvi, we just since you weren't on before when I mentioned this, we're trying to limit the presentations to 10 minutes so we have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So please go ahead and tell us what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. In fact, I'm both embarrassed and flattered by being in the company of this august galaxy of professors and scholars, because we journalists are everything by starts and nothing long. We are within the course of one revolving moon, chimist, fiddler, statesman, and buffoon. So we are, but I qualify to intervene and take part in this very, very important conference because while my scholar friends have been working and poring over documents, I have traveled to 110 countries, 110 countries, either with my cameraman or with my notepad and my pencil. So that qualifies me to, I think, to some extent, though not entirely. I'm an Indian journalist. Time was when we thought we had something resembling a liberal press. Let me begin with something slightly different. Aeschylus, the Greek tragedian, the master of Greek tragedy, 400 BC or so, he was also a warrior. In those days, people had these various definitions. And he said something. He said, when war breaks out, the first casualty is the truth. I don't think you need, this is rocket science that I'm revealing to you. My good friend, the late Philip Knightley, wrote a book, a masterly catalogue of war correspondence called The First Casualty. The first casualty being the truth. Let me begin my narrative with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the first imprimatur of a successful system on a defeated system was the Operation Desert Storm. People don't realize it. It was a much more important operation in terms of the information order than even the occupation of Iraq, which took place in 2003. Why? Because my friend Peter Arnett, from the terrace of Al Rashid Hotel of Baghdad, inaugurated something that you and I and generation had never seen. He brought a war live into our drawing rooms. Peter, CNN. And I remember Dick Cheney, who was then the defense secretary. He became vice president later for the occupation of Iraq. He said, oh, I've been seeing if the war is going very well. I've just seen it on CNN. And then Hosni Mubarak, it became an advertisement for CNN. Oh, the war is going well. I've seen it on CNN. Now that war had the following effect. It pulverized Saddam Hussein. The victorious West had put its imprimatur not only on victory over the Soviet Union, but generally, now we are here. We are the sole superpower, and this is our imprimatur. That one telecast of Peter Arnett's, divided the world into two sets of audiences. The victorious West and the pulverized, defeated, humiliated, a Muslim world again. Where we stood in India is still a toss-up. And many societies, that it's a little googly and tossing at you. Now, this went on. And then you had the two intifadas, and then the Bosnian War, And the Bosnian War, Europe said, no, even though everybody saw daily the brutalization of the Bosnians, Europe would not intervene, because if we intervene on one side, we have come together so that we don't quarrel. If we come together, if we come on the side of, say, the Serbs were with the Allies. If Germany comes on the side of Croatia was with the Axis. So we will not intervene. Genscher did something. He went and recognized Croatia ahead. That set the cat among the pigeons. Meanwhile, why I'm saying this, it is not recollection of pouring on document. I was there. I was in Zagreb. And Cardinal Kukovic of Zagreb Cathedral, he had been to Rome and met the Pope, completely misunderstood. And here you had, oh, the Axis is coming, the Axis is coming. So one set this news media that had been created, it had its fallout in the regions. We, in the subcontinent of India, we had our own copycat media. Don't forget that when the Soviet Union collapsed is precisely the moment when Indian economic liberalization began. Before that period, we had one channel called Doordarshan, which was a little bit like a state-run television. There was no multiple channels in India. Advertising, burgeoning an economy, demanded advertising space, and a multiple scores of channels grew up. But these channels had come on behalf of industry, the captains of industry, the corporate world. In other words, if they played up the problems of the people, social welfare, poverty, houses, land, drinking water, then people would stand up. We didn't want to agitate the people. The business must have its advertising. The middle class must be created by the kind of advertising that the middle class likes. And so you had a society which has gone not the liberal way. It has not gone the liberal way at all. Anyone who's keeping a steady gaze on India, that is what happened here. It was the media. And now, since the time is limited, let me tell you, when I entered the portals of a paper called The Statesman in my first innings as a young journalist in the late 60s, the line was, the newspaper Statesman in those days was owned by 12 different British companies. The whole hangover from the colonies was still there. The colonial system was retreating, but it had left behind some good institutions. And one of them was the Statesman. It was a great newspaper, and I have the privilege of having been groomed there. Now, what was the line? These 12 companies, they had a board of trustees, a board of governors and a board of trustees. Board of trustees gave the editor a line, the policy, and for the year, neither the market, nor the government, nor the proprietors ever bothered the editor. The editor, it was called, we support the establishment on a critical support to the establishment on an issue by issue basis. In other words, in a democracy, people bring a government into being. Our job is not to quarrel with people's verdict, but to see on behalf of the people that the government functions, whether it is the BJP, fascist, communist, ultra-left, ultra-right was not our business. We were there to support people's verdict on an issue-by-issue basis. That system in India got broken during the Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. Mrs. Gandhi's emergency disbanded the press. And they grew two bodies, those who hated Mrs. Gandhi and those who hated Mrs. Gandhi. That has continued to this day. In the global arena, the Soviet and the so-called progressives and the capitalists, what should have been celebrated globally as the victory of democracy, of human rights, and of good governance was celebrated. These words were never mentioned then. It was celebrated as a victory of the market. Rampaging capitalism is what had won. And for that, the price is being paid regionally and everywhere. Now, at the moment, we are having, with this, the media, what happens? I quoted Aeschylus. When war breaks out, so this Americans have been, Trump asked Carter, sir, the Chinese are going ahead. What should we do? Carter turned back and said, look, since 1979, the Chinese have not been at war. They had that war with Vietnam, if you remember, and I covered that war. Now, after that, we, said Carter, have never stopped being at war. And our media, therefore, has never stopped being a war media. And therefore, one of the great tragedies of our time is the singular collapse of the credibility of the Western media. Yes, we watched the tragedy of Bucha with misty eyes. Yes, we watch what is going on in Ukraine. But the question remains at the back of our mind. Is this the whole truth? It is unlike My Lai. When Walter Cronkite went and exposed the whole thing, and it changed the trend of the Vietnam War. Today, there is doubt on Bucha. There are those who want to believe it. There are those who want to suspect what is being reported. There is this division. And what is in the bargain is the new global order. Where is the media in all of this? We have to think very deeply on that one. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Naqvi. I think that was a very interesting, brief walk through history to give people a sense of why the media has come to where it is. Our next speaker is Dr. George Koo. He's a retired business consultant, the chairman of Burlingame Foundation, and his topic is U.S. sanctions on Russia and China are suicide for the dollar. Dr. Koo?
Hello, everybody. My name is George Koo. I'm a retired international business advisor, and I write occasionally for Asia Times. My latest op-ed posted earlier this week pointed out that we are facing some consequential blowbacks from the Ukraine war, and that those blowbacks could threaten our very existence on Earth. Now, I was referring to the fact that Washington seems to feel that they can win a nuclear showdown with Russia, and the neoconservatives that's running the Biden administration actually think that is winnable, and that is scary, folks. I'm assuming that there will be other speakers that will address this issue, and an important one in the Q&A. For the amount of time allotted to me, I want to address why the self-inflicted injury by the Biden administration will spell the demise of the American dollar. First of all, American policy is based on a very simple playbook. If you don't do what we ask you, we will sanction you beyond the level of pain that you can stand. In case of Russia, U.S. started out by freezing Russian reserve to the tune of 300 billion. France froze about 22 billion euros. The U.S. and UK confiscated the gold that's on deposit in London and New York. Even other allies, even Switzerland, have joined in to add to the pain, Russia's pain. But when Russia didn't give up and didn't cry uncle, Biden decided to add more pressure by ordering the seizure of personal property and real estate in the U.S. held by selected oligarchs, including especially those that are known to be close to Putin. At the same time, Biden kicked Russia off SWIFT, the International Financial Transfer System. SWIFT stands for, by the way, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. In effect, Biden has taken Russia off global commerce. Many experts have pointed out what Biden has done is unprecedented in modern history. In one stroke, any country can see that if they incur the displeasure of the U.S., they can be wiped out, their reserve and personal assets taken and confiscated by the U.S. Instead of acting like an honorable fiduciary, the U.S. is acting like gangster and bully. Biden has put the full faith and credit of the United States in serious doubt. In order for Biden to exert maximum impact on Russia, the U.S. needs most, if not everybody, in the world to join the sanction and stop doing business with Russia. So far, other than U.S., Canada, and the EU countries, not even Mexico, by the way, none of 53 African countries have joined the sanction. None of the 33 Latin American countries have. None of 22 Middle East countries have. Only three of the 48 countries in Asia, namely Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, have. Australia and New Zealand are among the island countries that have joined the sanction. Major countries with large populations and purchasing power, such as Brazil, India, China, have not stopped doing business with Russia and thus keep the Russian economy going. Apparently, the White House was caught unprepared when Putin announced that Russia will only accept ruble for payment for their natural gas and oil to quote, unfriendly countries. And then he also added, say, we'll take gold as well at 500 rubles to a gram. This is especially painful for EU because they depend on Russia for 40% of their natural gas supply. So, and the natural gas is not merely to heat homes, which is important until the winter's over, but also it's a major feedstock for the petrochemical industry in Europe. So the EU countries can cry foul, protest, and refuse to pay, but Putin says, well, that's fine, no ruble, no gas. Russia also has a rupee to ruble deal going with India with a favorable pricing, bargain pricing for India. Even before the war in Ukraine, countries have been minimizing or reducing their exposure to the dollar anyway. Russia has a long-term contract with China to be settled in renminbi. Saudi Arabia also has a long-term deal with China for their oil based on the renminbi or the yuan. China has swap agreements with 40-some countries in which both countries agree to settle their deals, their trade in local currency, and avoid having to hold on to dollars. Russia is also a large exporter of grain, agricultural products, and chemical fertilizer, Putin is likely to add those to ruble-only deals. So it will be a matter of time when EU countries will decide that siding with US is too expensive, too painful, in exchange for the inflationary shortages that they will experience. Bulgaria, Hungary, so far are among the EU countries that have already caved in. Ukraine, by the way, is also a supplier of important food and agricultural products, and their inability to produce will also affect not only the EU, but the worldwide problem in terms of starvation, shortages, and inflation. The exchange rate of the ruble plummeted when the sanctions were first announced, but Putin's counter in pegging the ruble to real assets has meant that the ruble has bounced back to the pre-war level. So the rest of the world can see all this and has to decide whether holding the ruble pegged to real assets is better or the dollar backed by the heretofore sacrosanct full faith and credit of Washington. The American public may not fully appreciate that one consequential blowback is a worldwide lost confidence on the dollar, which is not pegged to any real assets or gold. By acting unilaterally, the American dollar is no longer a safe place for anybody's foreign reserve or tycoons' private wealth. As a result, increasingly, the dollar is not going to be worth the paper it's printed on, and history will show when the U.S. economy collapses that this is attributable to Biden's folly. The U.S. knows only one diplomatic approach, which is to threaten sanction. And they may try it on China because so far what Blinken's message and his colleagues to China is join our sanctions, stop doing business with Russia or else. How will China react to the threat? China is the leading trading partner for over 120 countries, virtually the entire world. China has become the factory of the world and makes products that everybody needs and wants to buy, and that includes the United States. So China is not going to be intimidated by the threat of sanction. If Biden were to insist on economic sanctions on China, the blowback will hurt the American consumer. Made in America factories to replace China's factories will take a very long time. In the meantime, American consumers will face inflation and scarcity. It's becoming increasingly apparent that the U.S. speaks loudly but carries a shriveled stick. It's just not scary anymore. In attempting to decouple from China, the U.S. will find itself standing alone and holding a dollar that nobody else wants to hold on to anymore. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Koo, thanks for that. It's important that these truths get out there. We now have two contributions from the nation of Colombia, both from trade union leaders. One is Freidike Gaitan, who's the president of the CTU Workers' Confederation of Colombia, and he'll be speaking on the International Labor Organization tripartism, the key approach for a stable and lasting global peace. And he'll be followed by Pedro Rubio, another trade union leader from Colombia and a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche. His topic is South America and the New Development Architecture.
Reciban un cordial saludo de la Confederación Central Unión Sindical Colombiana del Trabajo, CTUSTRA.
Greetings from the CTU Uskrab Workers' Confederation of Colombia. It is very important for Colombia and Latin America to pay attention to everything that is going on at this global juncture. We've lived through a global pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia issue, which affects the whole world. This forces us to think about what the policy agenda is going to be moving forward. We should speak of a new world order, and we should consider whether or not human beings are going to continue to be at the center of events, and whether or not human beings are the most important thing for those centers of thought, such as the centers of power, where we see that the harm done to human dignity and to life itself has reached a serious and enormous crossroads, such that it could easily be replaced by artificial intelligence. It's no longer a matter of the thinkers of some economic theoreticians, where man uses man, where man is enslaved, and then he is freed and goes on to the concept of the proletariat, and evolves to the concept of the new world of labor. So we all have to ask ourselves the question, are human beings really at this time at the center of the thinking of those think tanks and centers of power? We think that they should be.
El otro punto importante de ese ejercicio es ver la evolución histórica misma del concepto del mundo del trabajo.
The other important issue is to look at the historic evolution of the concept of the world of labor and the global conflicts that have occurred throughout history. The Treaty of Westphalia is one key reference point to take into account, as is the Versailles Treaty, despite the disruptions and some deviations that have been found in them. But we believe that in the case of the Versailles Treaty, as a labor confederation established on the basis of the thinking of the International Labor Organization, or ILO, which was created as part of Versailles, that tripartism is necessary if we are going to speak of a stable and lasting peace. Another very important matter we have to keep in mind is the role of the ILO and the UN. If we want the development of nations to be symmetrical, we necessarily have to see if these two organizations are valid or not. For us, the ILO is valid, both because it is and has a democratic sense of participation because of its 3 electoral colleges, a vote by the state, through the government, a vote by workers, and a vote by employers. The UN has a disruption, which is its Security Council. Only some have achieved the armed power of having nuclear bombs and other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, which allow them to be there. But there is no consensus, no democratic decision-making by all nations. That generates the asymmetries that we find today. It's important to consider that in these new architectures, we have to find an equilibrium to furthermore be able to speak of global social justice. That is a policy agenda built by blocks, and that can't mean going back to unipolarity nor to bipolarity. We should be talking about a minimum of 5 blocks, and Latin America should play a strong role among them. We see the example that Africa, which has used the tripartite system, today leads the International Labor Organization.
Entonces, pues, llamamos a ese ejercicio que se siga fortaleciendo el diálogo social entre las naciones.
So we call for that to be done, to keep strengthening social dialogue among nations. It is not easy to interpret the tensions because there are tensions between some agendas and others, and that's what we are seeing in that conflict. Despite the fact that some want to reduce it to the issue of Ukraine and Russia, it is global tension. So for the CTU Uskrab Confederation, it's important to return to the tripartite mechanism, to consider the deformation that the UN has in its Security Council and other asymmetrical situations, such as the intervention of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. In the ILO, their role is clearly defined, but in the UN, the disruptive capital groups, which even control states themselves, torpedo a true agenda of global policies and obstruct a new architecture which would generate true development for all nations and which would generate a sense of security for all.
Bueno, un cordial saludo desde Colombia. Nosotros venimos impulsando.
Greetings from Colombia. We have been promoting initiatives and proposals for the entry point into the South American continent through the Darien Gap and Colombia. to become not only a pivotal point for the World Land Bridge, or the New Silk Road, as it's also known, but also from the standpoint of a new economic and development architecture for all nations, that it ensure not only the food sustenance of Colombian nationals, but also that it be transformed into a supplier of food for the planet. Paradoxically, we have very fertile land by world standards because we are part of the equatorial belt, and we have a diversity of climates which makes it possible for Colombia to produce food 365 days a year. So we have great potential.
Y queremos traer a colación el cálculo del padre de la biogeoquímica rusa, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky.
I'd like to mention the calculations made by Vladimir Vernadsky, the father of Russian biogeochemistry, which we have applied to determining the ability to maintain a given population per square kilometer. It's quite interesting, for example, that in the case of Colombia, we have 446,656 square kilometers of arable land and a population of 49.6 million people, whereas we could feed a population of 67 million.
Con la posibilidad que tenemos hoy actualmente de producir comida en territorio colombiano, optimizando.
In other words, with the potential that we have today of producing food on Colombian territory, making use of technology, and Vernadsky's calculations were based on the technology available at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, with technological advance, the optimization of our agricultural land in order to feed people means we could even double that amount. In other words, I would venture to say that it is possible to feed an average of up to 75 to 80 million people on the land we have in Colombia.
Para el caso específico de nuestro vecino, Venezuela, un país limítrofe con Colombia.
If we turn to the case of our neighbor, Venezuela, which shares a border with Colombia, Venezuela has 216,000 square kilometers of arable land, with a population today of 28.8 million. By optimizing that territory based on modern technological advances, they could feed more than 40 to 45 million people. And it's here that we have a sovereign decision that must be made by nations, based on the need to make every square kilometer or every hectare of land, depending on how you measure it, more productive in order to ensure the food supply.
Enfrentar la amenaza de hambruna mundial que efectivamente.
In that way, we can face the threat of world famine that the FAO and the UN and many other voices internationally are warning about. That it is not only coming, but it is already underway internationally, and that it is necessary to immediately activate an economic recovery plan for nations that have agricultural potential to intensify the policies to be able to be the food suppliers of the world and not only of their own populations. As you can see here, it's important to implement the approach of development corridors in order to ensure the flow of the necessary inputs so that both the imports as well as the exports of food can be carried out through these development corridors that are proposed as part of the New Silk Road. That, we believe, is what must be done at this moment, at this punctum saliens that we are facing in history.
Y tenemos dos caminos. Uno, avanzar hacia una nueva era, un renacimiento.
We have two paths available. One to advance towards a new era, a renaissance of economic growth and of dialogue of cultures, or what some theoreticians of the clash of civilizations are proposing, a dark age of perpetual wars and conflicts among nations. We in Colombia have the hope that the entire planet and these forums of dialogue deepen the necessary advance of a dialogue of cultures and economic cooperation which the planet so needs. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senor Gaitan and Pedro. And now we're going to go into the question and answer session. And judging by the number of questions we're getting, this panel has certainly stirred some things up. And we'll be joined by Professor Lin, Dr. Koo, Senor Gaitan, Dennis Small, and Helga is also joining us. I'm going to start with a couple of questions which I'll direct to one or two of you, but anyone who wants to say something on it, please show me your hand and we'll bring you in. Let me start, Dennis, since you raised this whole question of the potential starvation of 1 billion people. There's a question that came in on the result of the Ukraine crisis on world hunger. Is this making things worse, or wasn't there already a crisis before this?
Yes, there absolutely was a crisis before this. And the Ukraine situation has just poured more oil on the fire. But what was underway, as Lyndon LaRouche discussed back in 1971, was the coming collapse of an entire system. The reason 1971 is because that's when the policy of floating exchange rate systems were established, which allowed for massive speculation to take over the entire world economy. A cancer took over the body economic. And therefore, with speculation and financial interests having the upper hand, the productive physical economy worldwide entered a period of collapse. Were that not to be reversed, LaRouche said, you will have both the effects of an economic collapse, hunger, pandemics, and so on, and you will also have the attendant wars that come from such a systemic breakdown crisis. Now, the reason that this floating exchange rate system was so disastrous is that it opened the door to a massive speculative bubble in the form of derivatives, which began and took over the entire financial system of the world, with very few exceptions. Today, we have close to $2 quadrillion in financial derivatives. Over $100 trillion, according to the official statistics of the BIS, are based on exchange rate bets back and forth. So the problem with the world financial architecture, it's not that we are simply saying, we don't like this building and we'd like to have a better one. This system is done with. It's gone. It is killing the world's population because it is defending a speculative cancer and is destroying all aspects of the productive economy. So the key to the concept of a new architecture, of a solution that we're proposing, when Helga talks about the Treaty of Westphalia, it's not simply an example of a treaty that was signed. It's a totally different concept of man than what has prevailed under the existing system since 1971, where since 1971, the concept of wealth has been financial wealth and therefore war of one against all. The contrary concept against that idea, on which incidentally gross domestic product is based, the entire measurement of an economy as GDP, is a fundamental axiomatic mistake. Instead, Lyndon LaRouche said, we have to measure an economy by potential relative population density. That is, the power of an economy to generate the conditions of living and the advancement of technology and science in particular to make sure that the entire world population can continue to move forward at higher standards of living. That is not a monetary question. That requires a different concept of man, returning to the concept of man as exemplified in the Treaty of Westphalia. And I think that that's the key also to what was stated earlier by, by Professor Lin. And I think it's really true that if you want to be rich, build roads first. Not rich in money. If you want to be rich in money, go into the drug trade, go into speculation, become a Wall Street banker. If you want to have a nation have actual richness, you have to build infrastructure because that's what develops the productive powers of labor and the potential relative population density as the actual measure of economy that has to replace gross domestic product. So that's why Ukraine was simply throwing oil on the fire, not Ukraine, but the sanctions applied using Ukraine as a justification. As Russian authorities have stated, if Ukraine hadn't existed, they would have invented something because their war against Russia and China pre-existed the situation around Ukraine. And that, I think, is the concept needed to come up with a solution of what the new architecture should be.
Anybody else care to comment on that? We have plenty of questions. So the second one I would like to direct to Professor Lin and Dr. Koo, but then anyone else can take it up also. Someone wrote in and asked, what is the role of the BRICS at this moment, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa? Are they still functioning, and how do they fit in with the Belt and Road Initiative? So Professor Lin, do you want to start that?
Well, they're still functioning marginally. First, BRICS set up the BRICS New Development Banks with the headquarters in Shanghai, and certainly the new development bank still there and operation, but the capital is very small, so the function they can do is limited. BRICS continue to have the summit, but certainly with the economic challenges, and so they may not have a large voice in the world, especially compared to the G20s. So yes, it's still there, but there's a lot of work the BRIC country need to enhance the cooperation and to give a voice in the G20s if the BRICS wants to have an impact.
Dr. Koo?
Yes, thank you. I think the whole idea of BRICS is very different from, for example, a NATO. It's not a military alliance. It's not organized to be against anybody. It's much more to enhance the spirit of collaboration. And indeed, as you can see, during this sanction campaign against Russia, none of the BRICS countries joined. They are part of BRICS. They're part of the collaboration with Russia. And I think it's similar to the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It also involves countries not for the purpose of a military alliance, but for the purpose of collaboration, cooperation. And SCO, which includes BRICS to almost all the BRICS, is actually more than half of the world in terms of land and population. So looking at it from that point of view, I think those are points to the direction of achieving what this conference is seeking to achieve, which is, let's not bomb everybody to the Stone Age. Thank you.
Anyone else want to comment on that? All right, well, Helga, I have one for you. Actually, it's 4 or 5 questions for you that come from the first panel and also the second one. Someone asks the question, how will this new movement be safe from being incorporated into the Great Reset? How do you keep the power hungry away from taking it over? Now, others have asked that there was some discussion of sustainable development, which is the line connected or associated with the Green New Deal or the COP26 conference. Someone else wrote in, why insist on Agenda 2030? Isn't that the policy of the globalists, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum? So I'll throw that one to you to distinguish between an idea of a development policy and what generally has been meant when people talk about sustainable development and green technology.
Well, obviously, the answer to the first question is that you have to be vigilant, obviously. But I think we, as the representatives of the LaRouche movement and the Schiller Institute, we have done a pretty good job of remaining independent for 50 years. And I'm not planning to change that in the later part of my life. And I would encourage our younger members to have the same resilience against corruption, which I think is a healthy attitude. Now, on the question of sustainability, I mean, the reason why I did not pick up on the issue, why I did not pick up on the issue is because, I mean, look, I think if we settle on the question of the sacredness of human life, and that we start with, to make sure that 1 billion people do not die, then the question is how you do it. You need food, you need, I insist that we need a modern health system in every country. And then, you arrive at, you have to study economics. And that's why I'm very happy that we have several excellent economists on this panel to further this discussion, because also my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, he discussed this question of what is actually sustainable, and he changed it in the question of durable existence, because there is a difference between short-term survival and long-term survival, and he has developed the economic scientific method, which I think is very important to think about, and that is that he developed the correlation between the relative potential population density, which can be maintained at a certain level of scientific and technological development, and the correlation to that of the energy flux density, which is being used in that particular production mode. So these are things, where if you want to keep a growing population alive and well nourished and well fed, and we want to have a decent education for every child being born, that requires certain economic scientific principles. And I think the big challenge will be to master these economic conceptions, because, I think the question which was arising earlier, how can we, as a grassroots movement, as Naidu was putting it, how can we combat the all-powerful, financial powers, the oligarchy? Well, I think it is through an education process where, in the final analysis, we want to have a society where every citizen is potentially capable to be the president, the economic minister, the education minister, the science minister, because people have a desire to qualify themselves. And the more people are qualified to actually do this job and be a competent minister or head of government, that is making the oligarchy eventually impossible. So this is obviously not a short-term question, but when you have a system of education like the Wilhelm von Humboldt system we had in Germany, or like China is actually doing it now with the aesthetical education, which President Xi Jinping is putting so much emphasis about, that is actually the best method to make people truly free and truly competent. And that way, I think we can eventually change the system completely.
Anyone else on that one? All right, here's one for Mr. Gaitan, and I think also Professor Lin and Dr. Ku might want to weigh in on this one. This is from Adeshola Koyuki, who's the founder of something called Equilibrium Perspectives. And he asks, how would a new development order address the debt burden that many nations are facing? Mr. Gaitan, Dennis will be translating, so you'll have to pause so that he can do the translation. You're muted. You have to unmute.
Muchas gracias. Quería hacer referencia a la anterior intervención de Loedra, porque se ha satanizado el tema de la Agenda 2030. ¿Sí? Precisamente el ser humano en su ejercicio de constructor histórico ha ido avanzando, ha ido evolucionando, y ha producido tratados muy importantes como el que aquí se determinó, que es la Paz de Westfalia. Pocos le dan buen sentido al Tratado de Versalles.
I would like to, first of all, thank you. And I would like to make reference to what has been said about those who had satanized or demonized the 2030 agreement. Human beings so far have been able to construct and evolve different policies and different agreements, and to propose treaties such as the Treaty of Westphalia, which has been discussed so far. But I would also like to mention the Versailles Treaty.
Bueno, quería retomar la parte anterior, la intervención anterior, respecto de la Agenda 2030. Hay un gran ataque a esta agenda y precisamente se debe a que, digamos, el ser humano en su proceso de construcción y evolución histórica, hay una gran contradicción después de, digamos, que llegó al alcance de la escritura y en los conflictos y en las conquistas del territorio ecúmene, estos tratados los firma todo el mundo, pero en el momento de tratar de cumplirlos no se cumplen. Digamos, como en el mundo de la pedagogía hay un currículo oculto y un currículo explícito. Hay una agenda de política pública y hay una agenda oscura.
For example,
disculpe, si es que no logramos sincronizarnos.
Yes, excuse me for overlapping in terms of the interpretation. I would like to return to the idea of the 2030 policy because there has been a big attack on it. Again, human beings in their evolution have created various procedures for advancing, but there has also been a big contradiction which develops at the point where conflicts are generated and wars occur and so on. Everybody signs these treaties, but not everyone actually follows what they say. For example, in the area of pedagogy, there is a hidden agenda and a real agenda.
Muchas gracias. Quiero referirme a la Agenda 2030. Insisto, la Agenda 2030 es un producto del diálogo social y de los mecanismos que el ser humano ha ideado dentro de los distintos conflictos. La Paz de Westfalia, el Tratado de Versalles. En ese ejercicio de construcción de acuerdos, el gran problema es la coherencia entre lo que se escribe y lo que se lleva a la agenda de política pública, lo que llamaríamos un poco más avanzado, lo de gobernanza. Entonces, hay una gran simulación en ese ejercicio de la agenda de política pública. La Organización Internacional del Trabajo generó un mecanismo y es hija no solamente de Westfalia, el proceso histórico de una guerra por parte de los españoles y los Países Bajos por 70 años, igual que lo que hoy llamamos Alemania por 30 años, y en ese proceso de pasar del feudalismo a, digamos, a la modernidad, a la premodernidad y la modernidad, y la construcción de estados nacionales, pues el Tratado de Versalles creemos que generó el organismo multilateral más importante, que es la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que hoy demuestra, a pesar de después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, se subsume a la ONU, tiene el mecanismo para generar la equidad y lo que llamamos en los 100 años de la OIT en el 2019, la justicia social como eje social para la paz estable y duradera. Ese mecanismo se llama...
So returning to the issue of the role of treaties, such as that of Westphalia, in developing social dialogue among populations. Again, we have built accords, we have built agreements, but the issue has become one where the policy that has to be taken up by governments and implemented is not actually done so. I believe that the ILO mechanism, which has been created coming out of the Versailles Treaty, is the most appropriate one for dealing with the kind of conflict we're facing today. The Treaty of Westphalia was absolutely critical from the passage from the Middle Ages into the modern world, the War of Spain against the Low Countries, the transit from feudalism into the modern world, and the creation of the nation state. The ILO, however, comes out with an approach for addressing crises, which after World War II was subsumed under the United Nations, but it is the principle of equity, which for 100 years has been the basis and the best basis for building a society based on social justice.
Ese mecanismo se llama el tripartismo. Es un mecanismo donde intervienen los trabajadores, los empleadores, o sea, los empresarios y los estados a través de los gobiernos. Y tiene un proceso que viene en construcción que genera desde el territorio, la región, y ya en un encuentro que es la Conferencia Mundial en Ginebra, produce, después de una gran discusión, los convenios internacionales. El mecanismo, en su esencia central, es el ser humano y el respeto a la vida. Y ese mecanismo no solamente ha producido unos convenios internacionales claves para la paz duradera, sino la Agenda 2030. El grave problema es quienes manipulan la política pública a través de organizaciones no gubernamentales y sectores disruptivos que les interesa acumular riqueza material a expensas de la vida en general.
So the mechanism that came out of the creation of the ILO was the approach called tripartism, which involves the role of workers, employers, and governments. And this process first begins on national territories, then it comes into a world meeting in Geneva, and then international agreements are established. The key point is that it places human beings and the respect for life at the center of those kinds of agreements. This is the key to actually building a peace, and it is also the basis of the 2030 program. The problem has been that those who manipulate policy through NGOs and other instruments, including those who are more interested in wealth, have undermined this process.
Well, let me get back to the question then, because I think that's
clave.
I want to get back to the question that was posed on debt, because I think that does make more concrete what you're talking about. And in this, again, Professor Lin and Dr. Koo, how would a new development order address the debt burdens that nations are facing? If you want to talk about equity, nations that are unable to develop because the debt must be paid first, how would you suggest this be addressed in a new development order? Professor Lin?
Okay, so that certainly is an issue in a developing country because they don't have the privilege like the reserve currency country, US or the EU. They can print money to buy the goods or to pay back the debts. But however, for the developing countries, we not only to look at the debt, we also need to look at the asset that they have. And when we talk about the Silk Road initiative, certainly you need to make investment. And for the developing country currently, they don't have sufficient fund to support the infrastructure investment. And to make the investment possible, they may have to borrow money to increase the debt. However, those debt will be make investment in infrastructure itself is an asset. Not only so, those kind of assets will enabling the country to have the structural transformation, and with those kind of structural transformation, they can increase their productivity, can create jobs, and generate growth. And with that, they can earn more money to pay back the debt and also to increase the income. So there's some talk about a debt trap, but I don't think they do not distinguish those kind of debt to make investment to improve the infrastructure and to increase the asset, and also to in general to enhance their capacity to generate more growth. So if that is used for the purpose, I think the developing country will have a larger potential to generate the financial resources to make their growth possible. And with that, the debt can be paid back and they can get rid of the debt trap.
Thank you. Dr. Koo, do you want to add anything?
Well, it's very, very, very quickly, I agree with everything that Professor Lin said. I just think that the Belt and Road Initiative, as promoted by China, is along the lines of creating the infrastructure that will lead to assets that will generate income for that country, which means that you will initially incur more debt, but it's going to be productive debt. It's not going to be debt that goes to line the pockets of crooked politicians and leaders. So that's really one of the most effective solutions for a country to get out of debt on a long-term basis.
Okay, Helga, I have one. Oh, Dennis, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to say a word or two on this subject. The issue of debt is actually overshadowed by orders of magnitude by the problem of financial derivatives on a world scale. Now, if we mean by debt, if we include in that financial derivatives, then we're talking about the nature of the actual problem. But if you compare the order of magnitude of all the debt in the entire world, third world debt, advanced sector debt, private debt, public debt, everything, it may be a couple of $100 trillion. Similarly with stock market investments and so on. But the derivatives bubble is an order of magnitude larger. It is speculation built on top of speculation. And it is that which was introduced with the 1971 collapse of the fixed rate system. Now, these two issues are very closely related because in developing sector countries, and I've had the opportunity to study the situation in the nations of Ibero-America most closely, what happened with the foreign debt was an absolute and complete fraud because the money was not lent for the purpose of the kind of productive investment, which both Professor Lin and Dr. Koo have mentioned. That, of course, would have been very nice. But the strings attached to those loans was very specifically from the IMF in particular that you could not use it for productive activity. What it was used for was repaying old debt. And what happened was countries in Latin America would pay off their debt, but after they had finished paying it off, the total amount of debt grew. The reason that happened, something I've referred to as banker's arithmetic, is because financial warfare against those countries was launched. Their currencies were massively devalued. The international terms of trade were rigged against them. So they were in a situation where the more they worked to pay the debt, the more indebted they became. And the key point about IMF conditionalities throughout this was not that they wanted country to pay their debt. They don't. The key point was to make sure that they would never invest in the kind of productive activity that, for example, the Belt and Road represents today, and would instead remain in perpetual chains. So when you're dealing with a speculative bubble of this size, you are not talking about legitimate debt. You are talking about fraud. You are talking about usury. And what you are going to have to do to build a new architecture, and my authority and my source on this is Lyndon LaRouche. He said very clearly, you have to take that entire mountain of debt and put it through bankruptcy reorganization. You have to freeze it. You have to put it aside. You can't pay it. If you try to pay it, you will kill people, which is what's happening today. Once you have done that, then you can establish the kind of credit issuing mechanism that both Professor Lin and Dr. Koo are referring to, as China represents, as Alexander Hamilton represented in the United States, of issuing credit that guarantees increases in the potential relative population density, guarantees increases in the productive powers of labor. That will increase more rapidly than the issuance of debt, making sure that the debt is completely repayable. But what you must do is you have to put an absolute barrier between the financial speculative cancer, all 2 quadrillion of it, and the issuance of productive credit. Again, inside the United States, that was known as the Glass-Steagall law, where you had exactly that banking separation. When you are a country, as Dr. Lin was referring to, Professor Lin was referring to, where you don't have the privilege of just printing money and calling it wealth, but you actually have another currency that you have to deal with. The form that Glass-Steagall takes is absolute exchange controls, no to the cancer, and a fixed exchange rate, and then you can issue sovereign currency for the process of development. There will be no possibility of a new architecture economically to allow us to have the kind of growth which we were talking about unless this entire system is put through bankruptcy reorganization. A healthy body cannot coexist with cancer. That's the essence of the approach that we have to take today.
Okay. Well, Helga, this one was addressed to you. And it's about, what about China and the Eurasian Economic Union? They were said to be ready to unveil an independent international monetary and financial system based on a new international currency calculated from an index of national currencies of participating countries and international commodity prices. Is this a good solution?
Well, I think it's presently the only available one because, what is, for example, Russia supposed to do, when it's being sanctioned, with the explicit aim to crush the Russian economic system. So I think, Russia is just, saying, as it reacted in the beginning to the sanctions, that it was actually, there are some people in Russia who think it was actually healthy for Russia because Russia was forced to go into own production in areas where they had not been so strong before. So it actually increased the economic strength in agriculture. It started to force Russia to build up basically investments in capital goods. And right now, all the energy which Europe wants to embargo Russia with, there are many countries in Asia in particular who are very happy to replace the Europeans. The United States, by the way, they did not stop the import. They increased the oil import by 43% last week. So, this is now happening between many countries. The Saudi Arabia was mentioned doing trade with China on the basis of the renminbi. India and Russia are ruble. And I think the idea of pegging these currencies to commodities is actually a step in the right direction. I mean, the danger of all of this naturally is if you have a complete decoupling between the Western countries and the, let's say, Asian countries and Russia and China in particular. I think this embodies the danger of, Dr. Koo was talking about, that this will backfire and cause a tremendous backlash. And the danger naturally is a plunge into chaos. But if you are put with the back against the wall and have no other possibility, then you are trying to do the best you can. And maybe that will shock some countries in Europe into reason. And the more countries say we need a new paradigm in the way we are discussing it at this conference, the better, because our approach is still that the solution should be all inclusive And if it goes through some ruptures in between, maybe that's necessary. But, the aim still must be to arrive at an all-inclusive system, because anything else has incredible dangers associated with it. But, sometimes you can't do what is best, and you have to do what is possible.
There's sort of a follow-up to that. Someone asks, would a single currency for international trade perpetuate monetary speculation? Do we need multiple currencies, or could we come up to an agreement with a single currency? Anyone want to take that one? Dennis, you want to start?
Yeah, really by also addendum to what Helga was saying and leading into this question, that same speculative dollar that the Russians and the Chinese and Indians and everyone is trying to separate themselves from just in self-defense is the same London-based dollar. This is not the American currency. This is a London-based speculative system, which is also the same financial instrument that the United States of America should separate itself from. The basis for building that kind of all-inclusive approach is that the United States must join with the Belt and Road Initiative, and we ourselves must break with the London dollar and reestablish our own greenback dollar, a US currency. And that's what the Glass-Steagall legislation is all about. So this is not something that needs to be hostile to the United States. Quite the contrary. This is in the best American tradition. We ourselves must reject that same speculative currency, the London dollar, and reestablish an American dollar. I think that's the proper approach, and I think that also leads towards answers to the second question that was asked.
Professor Lin or Dr. Koo, any thoughts on that? Well, here's another question on the Belt and Road Initiative. Someone wrote in and asked, what about the problems of corruption in countries where the Belt and Road Initiative is being extended? Must political change occur before economic partnership, or do you think economic partnership will deal with the political problems? Professor Lin, you want to take that first?
Well, I think that every country, they have the dream or aspiration to generate jobs for their people and to enhance the different standard of their people, if they know the way to do it. I think that is the dream of every nation. And for the politician, I think their goal, certainly they want to stay in power. And also, if they can stay in power, they want to be considered as the hero of their nation. And the way to do it is to generate growth, to create jobs, to enhance the living standard of their people. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative, the infrastructure investment, will enable the politician to have the way to fulfill the dream of the people and also their aspiration as a national leaders. So under the kind of situation, I don't think the Belt and Road Initiative will invite the corruption if we design the infrastructure project in a way can really contribute to the development in their nation.
I think realized.
Yeah,
go ahead, Doctor.
It's the temptation for corruption is always there. Based on past experience, certainly straightforward, charitable foreign aid, as practiced by the West, probably lends to even more opportunity for private under-the-table payments between politicians and the country giving the aid. In terms of Belt and Road type projects, if it's specifically tied to a particular infrastructure, and if the deal is transparent, it's going to minimize the temptation or the possibility of corruption. So I think that will, at least in part, ameliorate the leakage of investments, if you will.
Okay. I have one more comment. It has to be quick because we have to move on. So go ahead.
No sé si interrumpo y me permiten un segundo la palabra. Es que quedó cortado todo lo que iba a expresar desde el mundo.
Darf ich Deutsch sprechen?
Do we have a German translator available?
If need be, I can.
If you're brief, Helga can translate, so please go ahead.
Okay.
Ich kann
Was bisher gesagt wurde, ist sehr wichtig und essentiell. Wir brauchten eine mächtige Friedensbewegung und die haben wir im Moment nicht. Ich hoffe, dass sich das mehr und mehr entwickelt, denn es sieht nicht gut aus auf dieser Welt. Wenn es überhaupt eine Aufgabe für uns Menschen in diesem, sagen wir mal, irdischen Dasein gibt, dann ist es, sich zu humanen Wesen zu entwickeln. Wir wundern uns gerade jetzt wieder, und ich möchte auf die Situation Deutschlands mal eingehen, wir wundern uns über die Aggression, die von der deutschen Regierung nach Vorgaben aus den USA gegen Russland ausgehen. Dazu ist es wichtig zu wissen, dass Deutschland seit 1945 und bis heute ein besetztes Land ist. Ein Land, das unter Form...
Could you finish, because we are short on time.
Einen Moment, wenn ich übersetzen soll, machen Sie bitte eine kleine Pause. Das ist übrigens Dr. Bittner, ein sehr bekannter Autor aus Deutschland. Er sagt,
English,
was auf dieser...
Oh,
I'm sorry. I said...
Go ahead.
I was introducing Dr. Bittner, who is a very important author and philosopher from Germany, and he said what is being discussed at this conference is very essential. What we need is a powerful peace movement, which does not yet exist, but hopefully will develop, because it does not look very good in the world. The main task of human beings with their life is to develop a humane identity. And in that context, I want to point to the aggression of the German government, which under the pressure of the United States is right now committing against Russia. For this, it is important to know that Germany from 1945 to today is still an occupied country.
Ja, Deutschland, ich möchte sagen Restdeutschland, wurde und wird bis heute ein Friedensvertrag verweigert. Es ist de facto immer noch ein Feindstaat nach Artikeln 53 und 107 der Charta der Vereinten Nationen. Wenn man das weiß, wird vieles klarer, auch hinsichtlich der Feindpropaganda gegen Russland und auch gegen China, die absurde und entsetzliche Formen angenommen hat. Also ich wünsche uns allen Frieden auf dieser sehr verletzlichen Erde und alles Gute Ihnen allen.
What people have to consider is that the present German state, whatever is left of it, does not have a peace treaty. it officially still has the status of an enemy country according to Article 53 of the UN Charter. Once one knows that, it becomes much clearer why Germany is engaged in such a enemy hostile propaganda against Russia and also China, which right now takes absolutely absurd forms. So I wish us all peace, and I wish success to the effort of this conference.
Vielen Dank. Well, we're at the end of the panel, so we have a chance for everyone to give a 1-minute summary. I'm sorry to cut it short, but I want to start with Mr. Gaitan, and then we'll go around for everyone to make a final comment. So, Senor Gaitan, 1 minuto.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Creo, y así lo sabemos en la central, es que digamos que la enfermedad, los síntomas, las causas, ya se tienen claridad, lo expuso muy bien, en fin, todos los compañeros frente a la especulación y el daño que se hace. Lo más importante que creemos de esta conferencia es buscar el mecanismo que permita a la humanidad generar un acuerdo real para paz estable y duradera, escoger entre la guerra o el diálogo social. Y el diálogo social nos puede permitir hablar, porque hay sectores que uno ya escucha, de hablar de bipolaridad. Yo no creo eso, yo creo que hay que hablar de unos nuevos bloques. Entre eso, América Latina tiene una gran oportunidad, como lo tiene África, que acaba de tomar el asiento de la dirección de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo. Y ese Consejo de Seguridad no puede seguir dañando la democracia de las Naciones Unidas, porque muchos también querrían que la ONU se acabara. No es ese el camino. Entonces, hay el mecanismo, hay todas las herramientas, hay los convenios que pueden solucionar el tema de lo que llamamos la nueva arquitectura. Comparto eso, del tema de la deuda. Hay todas las herramientas para hacer un reinicio y hablar de una nueva arquitectura y atrevernos a decir, sí, un nuevo orden mundial, pero fundando las herramientas que el mismo hombre ha creado: diálogo social, mecanismo tripartito, y no a la guerra, que es lo que pretenden quienes desde una agenda oculta manipulan la política global. Gracias.
Thank you very much. What I would like to say is that we've seen through the various presentations during this conference that the sickness of humanity is very clear. Everyone has said it very clearly. We have to get rid of speculation. The key issue that has to come out of this conference is, what is the mechanism with which we can arrive at a real peace, an end to war? Will we have war, or will we have social dialogue and peace? I don't agree with those who propose a bipolar world. I propose a world that has many different groups in it. For example, Latin America should play a key role. Africa already does, for example, its role in heading the ILO. The Security Council of the United Nations has done great damage, but I don't agree with those who say that the United Nations should be ended because of it. Mankind has tools. We can create a new architecture. We can and should get rid of the debt. We have to restart a new architecture. We have to build a new world economic order. Man's capability of having a social dialogue, a tripartite social dialogue, is the best mechanism at hand to put an end to war and to create a lasting peace.
Mr. Gaitan. George, 1 minute.
Thank you. So far, the session talked about redesigning, talked about ending war, talked about ending debt. All of those things are very important. But as an American, and as a proud American, I have to say the big elephant in the room that has to be somehow neutralized or removed from the scene is my American leaders in Washington. They insist on being the hegemon. They insist on dominating the world. And if it means combat, conflict, nuclear war, so be it. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that until that part is resolved, all the other things that we would like to have happen is gonna be facing a tremendous challenge. We have to change the mindset in Washington first and foremost before anything else, I think, can be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Koo. Professor Lin, 1 minute.
Okay, let me quote Keynes in his famous book as the last sentence. He said, "It is ideals, not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil." And I hope the ideas that we discuss in this conference, those good ideas will prevail in the world.
Wow, that was less than a minute. Very good. Helga, you can take his extra 30 seconds.
I just would like to make the point that sanctions should be banned because sanctions are a form of warfare. And I think both Russia and China have said that very clear. And they normally don't hit the elites, they hit the poor people, the most feeble ones, the old, the sick, the women, the children. And, you know, they're always aimed to get the population upset against the leadership and cause regime change. And I think this is really a very inhuman means of conducting relations to other countries, and I think it should be banned. I think sanctions, sanctions is something which we should get a public outrage against, and it should be put on the list of things which have to go.
Well, thank you, Helga, and thank you to all members of the panel. We will be back. I think we're going to take a half-hour break and then come back with the next panel on security. So thank you very much. And for those of you who are tuning in, we'll be back at, 7:30 Central Europe time and 1:30 Eastern time.